Hi everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to see you join me. And don't forget to like and let me know what you think in the comments. My name is Ava Carter. I'm 32, and even now, years after it happened in the spring of 2022, the dread still clings to me. I'm still haunted by the fragmented memories of what my friends and I lived through near Shadow Creek Falls. I'm putting this down, hoping someone out there might grasp the truth of what we faced, or at least believe I'm not completely out of my mind. Growing up on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, the wild was in my blood. Weekends meant exploring trails, breathing in the scent of pine, and sleeping under a canvas of stars. Ethan Blackwood, 30 and charismatic to the point of recklessness, was my partner in adventure. For years, we'd talked about pushing ourselves, venturing deeper into the untamed, far from the usual tourist paths. Shadow Creek Falls, with its unsettling local tales and raw, untamed beauty, felt like the perfect proving ground. Ethan was the kind of guy who laughed in the face of fear. Adrenaline was his drug, always chasing that next rush. Sometimes, his recklessness worried me, but I trusted him. A decade of friendship, he hadn't led me astray yet. Then, days before our trip, he called, his voice buzzing with an almost manic excitement. Ava. He practically vibrated through the phone. I've been reading about these haunted trails near Shadow Creek Falls. They say there's, don't know, a siren or something that haunts the area. We have to check it out. A siren. I knew the stories. A spirit, a wailing entity tied to loss and devastation, luring people to their doom. That was the myth. Shadow Creek Falls wasn't the Aegean Sea, though. Still, local legends had a way of taking on a life of their own. These tales spoke of a spectral woman named Seraphina, said to appear near the falls, her sorrowful cries echoing through the gorge, drawing travelers to their destruction. Fine, I conceded, but we keep it smart. No wandering off alone. No provoking any local ghosts, just for kicks. He laughed, that carefree sound I knew so well. Deal. Safe was a flexible concept with Ethan. I should have remembered that. 2 weeks before we were set to leave, our duo became a trio. Chloe Vance, an artist I knew from a shared workspace, joined our expedition. Chloe was warm, insightful, with a soul that seemed attuned to the subtle energies of the world. We'd bonded over her nature sketches, and she was captivated by the rumored haunting beauty of Shadow Creek Falls. This could be incredible inspiration for my new series, she'd said over coffee. Mind if I tag along? I hesitated. Shadow Creek Falls was remote, wild, with whispers of danger clinging to it like mist. But Chloe's enthusiasm was infectious, and honestly, I couldn't say no. So, it was set Ethan, Chloe, and me, heading into the unknown, a bright Thursday morning in mid-May. We drove away from the relentless pulse of Portland. The highway snaked through dense pine forests, the transition from city to wilderness stark and sudden. Strip malls vanished, replaced by towering evergreens. And then broad valleys opened up, stretching towards the horizon. I remember a strange hush falling over the car as we passed the first weathered sign for Shadow Creek Falls of 15 miles. We arrived just before sunset, setting up our tents in a designated campground, a short walk from the main trail. That first night held a deceptive peace. We roasted dinner over the fire, talked about the everyday grind of city life. and listened to the wind sighing through the trees. But even then, a prickle of unease ran beneath the surface. Maybe it was the absolute stillness, or how quickly the darkness swallowed the light, leaving us in an almost suffocating blackness. Ethan tried to break the tension with jokes, but I saw Chloe gazing into the firelight, lost in thought. She murmured about feeling strange vibrations in the area. Usually, I'd tease her. Chloe was known for her talk of auras and energies, but a shiver went down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling she might be picking up on something real. The next morning, we drove into the small town near the falls for supplies. Locals offered polite nods, but when Ethan, ever the instigator, asked about haunted spots, a couple of faces hardened. "Stay clear of the falls after dark," one older woman warned, her voice low and gravelly. "Bad things happen there. Folks go missing." She didn't elaborate, but I caught a flicker of something like fear in her eyes. Back at the campsite, Chloe pulled out her sketchbook, her charcoal pencil capturing the dense canopy of pines and the distant, shadowy outline of the falls. Ethan paced, restless energy radiating off him. "We should check out the upper trails," he said, a thrill-seeker's glint in his eyes. "See if there's any of those weird symbols I read about." He'd mentioned something about local cult symbols in his online research. I'd dismissed it as internet fluff, but Chloe looked intrigued. So, after lunch, we ventured deeper into the woods. And we found them. About half a mile from our camp, carved into the bark of ancient trees, strange symbols like runes. One symbol repeated again and again, two curved lines meeting at a central point, forming a shape disturbingly like an eye. "This is creepy," Chloe whispered, her pencil scratching furiously as she tried to capture the carvings in her book. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Ethan, though, was practically vibrating with excitement. He snapped photos with his phone, muttering about hidden cults, spirits tied to the falls, his theories spiraling into the fantastical. That night, the roar of the waterfall seemed louder, more intense, or maybe we were just more attuned to it. Chloe claimed she could hear a faint, mournful cry woven into the rush of water. I tried to tell her it was just the wind through the canyon, but doubt gnawed at me. An unnerving silence settled over us after sunset. Our campfire was a fragile island of light and warmth in the vast, encroaching darkness. Chloe rubbed her temples, complaining of a throbbing headache. Ethan, ever the joker, quipped, "Summoning the siren, are we?" She didn't laugh. Around midnight, it came. A distant wail, thin and piercing, threading through the constant thunder of the falls. Ethan's eyes snapped wide open. Chloe gripped my hand so hard my knuckles ached. We sat frozen, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. We tried to sleep, but sleep was a distant shore. Each of us tossed and turned in our tents, the forest seeming alive, whispering, beckoning. By morning, Chloe's headache was worse. Her face was pale, drained. She insisted she was fine, but something was definitely off. We hiked to the falls, the trail eerily deserted, unusual for a place that, under normal circumstances, would draw at least a few adventurous souls. The falls themselves were breathtaking, terrifyingly so. Immense curtains of water crashed into a dark pool below, a heavy mist clinging to the air, obscuring the forest floor. Every time I looked into that swirling haze, I thought I saw a figure, a woman's silhouette, hair streaming around her face. But when I blinked, it was gone. We found more carvings on the rocks near the waterfall, the same eye, like symbol etched into the stone. Ethan became obsessed, tracing the chiseled lines, as if searching for a hidden message. Then, Chloe suddenly grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. She stared at me, eyes wide and unfocused. "We have to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "We're not welcome here." Just as quickly, she recoiled, blinking, confusion clouding her features. "Sorry," she murmured. "I don't know why I said that." Despite her sudden warning, Ethan was set on staying. Part of me wanted to pack up, run, get the hell out of Shadow Creek Falls. But another part, a stubborn, worried part, felt compelled to figure out what was happening to Chloe, to Ethan, to us. And Ethan insisted we stay just one more night. Looking back, that was the decision that shattered everything. That single night changed us irrevocably. Sometime after dark, they came. I first noticed them as flickers of movement in the periphery. Then the beam of Ethan's flashlight caught glints of metal in the distance. 6, maybe 7 figures, masked, clad in dark, shapeless clothes. My heart slammed against my ribs. Before any of us could shout, 2 of them surged forward, tackling Ethan to the ground. Others grabbed Chloe. Someone's arm snaked around me from behind, pinning my arms, rough fabric smelling of earth, and something elsey, something metallic and cold. We were all screaming, a frantic, choked chorus of terror. I was thrown to the forest floor, the impact driving the air from my lungs. My face scraped against pine needles and damp dirt. One of the intruders pressed a heavy boot against the back of my neck, immobilizing me. Craning my head, I saw Chloe's captors dragging her towards the deeper woods. Ethan struggled wildly. A string of curses ripped from his throat, but they silenced him with brutal efficiency, clubbing him on the side of the head. Blood bloomed instantly, trickling down his temple, and he went limp. A masked figure bent over me, their breath hot and stale against my ear, whispering something in a language I didn't recognize, guttural, sibilant, chillingly alien. Then, rough rope cinched tight around my wrists, cutting off circulation. The group's silence was more terrifying than any shout. Their movements were coordinated, unnervingly calm, like a practiced ritual. They marched us deeper into the forest, the minutes stretching into an eternity, though it might have only been 15. Direction dissolved. The trees pressed in, suffocating, branches like skeletal fingers reaching for us. We reached a clearing. Torches ringed the space, casting a flickering, grotesque light. Twisted shapes carved in stone loomed out of the shadows. The same eye, like symbol, was everywhere, etched into crude totems, scarring the altar like stones. My mind reeled, trying to grasp the impossible reality. Ethan groaned somewhere behind me. Chloe, bound and gagged, looked half-conscious, her eyes glazed, lost in some internal darkness. A tall figure emerged from the group, stepping into the torchlight. He slowly removed a featureless mask. Maybe in his 50s, gaunt face, eyes like chips of ice. "We do not appreciate trespassers," he said, his voice resonating, echoing in the clearing. "But sometimes, visitors arrive for a reason." As he spoke, the others arranged themselves in a circle, beginning a low, rhythmic chant. The air thickened, heavy with a palpable dread. Horror, cold and sharp, pierced through me as I realized Chloe was the focal point of their ritual. They forced her to kneel on a flat, moss-covered rock. I could see her trembling lips working against the gag. The tall man walked towards her, deliberate, predatory. He placed a hand on her forehead. Chloe's eyes rolled back, showing only whites. Her body went rigid, convulsing as if an electric current had surged through her. Then, a piercing wail erupted from her throat. But it wasn't Chloe's voice. It was higher, layered, ethereal, echoing out into the trees, the sound that had haunted our nights. The siren. My blood turned to ice. The chanting intensified, growing louder, more frantic. I understood, with sickening certainty, they were trying to use Chloe as a vessel, a conduit for whatever entity they worshipped. Ethan, still dazed, tried to crawl towards her, a guttural sound of protest escaping his bruised lips. One of the cultists grabbed him, yanking him back with casual cruelty. That was when the tall man drew a curved knife. The firelight glinted on the honed steel. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. I was sure, gut-wrenchingly sure, we were about to witness Chloe's sacrifice. But instead of plunging the blade into her, he ran it across her forearm, a swift, precise cut, drawing a bead of dark crimson blood. Then, he did something even more disturbing. He smeared her blood across the carvings on a stone altar. Chloe screamed, a muffled, desperate sound against the gag. The cultists chanted, pressing the sides of their masks, as if in religious ecstasy. A sudden wind whipped through the clearing, swirling leaves and dust around us in a frenzy. Through that chaotic whirlwind, I caught glimpses of a spectral silhouette, a woman. Hair thrashing wildly around a face that was a blur of shadows, eyes like black voids. Seraphina, the siren, or something that had claimed that name. Everything dissolved into chaos. Chloe started convulsing violently, tearing at her restraints with unnatural strength. I'd never seen anything like it, a raw, inhuman power surging through her. Ethan, fueled by desperation, kicked backwards at his captor, catching the masked man off guard. He stumbled, and Ethan scrambled free, throwing a wild, desperate punch at another cultist. In that brief moment of disarray, I saw a chance. I twisted against my own bindings, my wrists screaming as the rough rope tore into my skin. I managed to slip free, staggering to my feet. But before I could even stand upright, Chloe lunged at me, eyes still rolled back, pupils vanished, just white orbs. She had the knife. I barely dodged her attack, stumbling backwards. "Chloe," I cried, a desperate plea. But the person in front of me wasn't Chloe anymore. Her body moved with jerky, unnatural speed. Another horrifying wail ripped from her lips, and the entire clearing seemed to vibrate, the torchlight flickering wildly. I saw Ethan wrestle a weapon from a stunned cultist, a broken spear or staff. He clutched it with trembling hands, brandishing it like a shield. One of the masked intruders tackled Ethan again, slamming his head against a rock with sickening force. I screamed his name, scrambling towards him. Chloe, or whatever controlled her, whirled, slashing the air with the knife. I fell back, my elbow slamming against a sharp stone. A jolt of white, hot pain shot up my arm, but I scrambled away, adrenaline masking the agony. That was when I heard Ethan's anguished cry. He slumped to his knees, blood coating the side of his face from a fresh wound. Chloe had turned on him with terrifying ferocity, her hollow eyes locked on him. Before I could even scream, she plunged the blade into his shoulder. He let out a strangled shout, then collapsed onto his side, unmoving. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I saw the cultists gathered around, some enraptured by Chloe's transformation, others horrified, as if this brutal turn of events hadn't been part of their plan. Choking back tears, I crawled towards Ethan. Every instinct screamed at me to save him. But Chloe, or the thing inside her, whirled on the cultists, screeching in pure, unadulterated rage. The tall man, his face a mask of shock and fury, stepped forward, trying to regain control. He shouted incantations, words I didn't understand, but her possessed eyes blazed with an inhuman fury. She charged him, a whirlwind of motion, and the moment she plunged the knife into his chest, chaos erupted. People scattered. Torches fell, spitting sparks and flames. The night flared with panic and firelight. In that pandemonium, I grabbed Ethan under the arms, half dragging him away from the blazing torches, away from the swirling mass of shrieking cult members. Chloe's expression flickered, a terrifying kaleidoscope of terror and malevolence. For a fleeting moment, she seemed to regain control, her face crumpling in horror as she glimpsed Ethan's bleeding shoulder. Ever, she mouthed silently, tears carving paths through the blood and dirt on her cheeks. Then, her face contorted again, lips twisting back in a silent, animalistic snore. Ethan was fading fast. Blood soaked his shirt, spreading like ink in water. I had to get him help. But how could I even escape the forest? We stumbled beyond the ring of torches. I propped Ethan against the base of a giant pine, desperately pressing my hand against his wound. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, reaching up to grip my arm weakly. "I'm sorry," he gasped, his voice a thread. "I shouldn't have. Listen to them." "Listen to who?" I pleaded, but his eyes rolled back, unfocused, and his head drooped. I patted his cheek, calling his name, fighting back the rising tide of panic and grief. Sirens seemed to wail in my ears, distant, mournful. But then I realized it wasn't sirens. It was the falls, the constant, deafening roar, or the echo of that siren's cry. Footsteps crunched behind us, snapping twigs. Two men in black suits, flashlights cutting through the undergrowth, sprinting towards us, guns drawn. Relief flooded me, a momentary, blinding wave. Hikers. Had someone finally called for help? But these men moved with a cold, terrifying precision that had nothing to do with local deputies. Earpieces glinted in the harsh flashlight beams. In seconds, they had us surrounded. "What's going on here?" One barked, his voice sharp, devoid of emotion. They saw Ethan, bleeding. Saw the fleeing cult members, silhouetted against the flames. Saw Chloe, still clutching the knife, a feral figure frozen at the edge of the clearing. Then, without warning, they opened fire. At Chloe. She ducked behind a tree, letting out a guttural snarl that was anything but human. I tried to explain, words tumbling out in a frantic rush. But they weren't listening. One of them grabbed me, hard, by the shoulders, forced me back to the ground, and barked into his radio. "Immediate containment. We have an incident. Possible foreign ritual group. Potential hostiles." That was all he said. Another man dragged Ethan away, before I could even protest. He was half conscious, barely able to moan. Chloe let out a shriek that froze everyone in place. She sprinted deeper into the woods, the knife still clutched in her hand, disappearing into the darkness. One of the agents raised his gun again, but his partner hissed, "Stand down. Keep it quiet." I had no idea what was happening, but I recognized the chilling seriousness in their eyes. These weren't just local police. Federal. FBI, maybe. The surreal realization sank in, the FBI was somehow involved. But how and why? They marched me back towards a dirt road, where a line of unmarked SUVs waited, engines idling. They cuffed my hands behind my back with plastic zip ties, ignoring my desperate pleas that Ethan needed medical help, that Chloe was possessed, ill, something monstrous. One agent was on the phone, his voice clipped, demanding that local law enforcement stand down and await further instructions. He seemed oddly, disturbingly concerned about public perception. I struggled, heart hammering, terror constricting my throat. "You don't understand." I choked out. "There's some kind of spirit entity." He cut me off, his gaze cold and dismissive. "Mom will handle it. We need you to remain silent." From the corner of my eye, I saw them load Ethan onto a stretcher, his head lolling to the side. Then they drove off with him in a separate vehicle. Another SUV took me away from the clearing, deeper into the woods, not towards the highway, not towards any sign of civilization, but deeper into the wilderness. I realized, with a fresh wave of dread, they were transporting me to some kind of local command post. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Eventually, we arrived at a small, nondescript building that looked like it had once been a summer cabin, now swallowed by the encroaching woods. Inside, the idyllic facade crumbled. It was a makeshift command center, humming with the cold, sterile energy of technology laptops, surveillance screens flickering with static, and a handful of stern-faced agents moving with grim purpose. They locked me in a side room, a bare space that smelled faintly of mildew and dust, and left me handcuffed to a metal chair. Hours crawled by, each tick of silence amplifying the dread. Snippets of conversation drifted from the main room, hushed, urgent. Talk of quarantining the area, searching for Subject 3, which I knew, with a sickening lurch, was Chloe, and disposing of cult evidence. My head spun, the events of the night replaying in a nightmarish loop. It felt like some twisted, hyper-real fever dream. Finally, an older agent entered the room. He introduced himself only as Agent Bailey. He set a tape recorder on the table, its red light a malevolent eye. Though I doubted any real record would exist once they were done with me. He asked me to recount everything that had happened in the forest. I told him the truth, the raw, unfiltered horror of it, the camping trip, the masked figures, the ritual, Chloe's possession by something ancient and malevolent we'd awakened. I even dared to whisper the name, Serafina. Bailey listened, his expression unchanging, a mask of professional stoicism. He occasionally jotted notes on a pad, his pen scratching a dry counterpoint to my trembling voice. When I finished, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, he sighed, a sound that held more weariness than sympathy. "We're containing the situation, Miss Carter." But he delivered the next words with practiced indifference, the chilling pronouncements of a bureaucrat sanitizing a horror. "The story that will go out, should anyone ask, will be that your party encountered a dangerous group of illegal squatters involved in a homicide. We've unfortunately had to declare Ethan Blackwood a suspect, given the circumstances." My jaw dropped.
"What? Ethan's not a suspect."
"He's a victim." He waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that erased Ethan, Chloe, everything we'd endured. "It's best if you cooperate, Miss Carter. If you do, we can ensure your release and your safety." Fury, hot and sharp, surged through me. "Is Ethan alive?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Bailey's face remained impassive, betraying nothing. He's receiving medical attention, was all he offered, a carefully measured crumb of information. Then he stood, the interview abruptly concluded. That's all you need to know. And he was gone, leaving me chained to the chair, adrift in a sea of unanswered questions. Hours bled into each other. No one else came to see me. At some point, I heard shouting from outside. A flurry of commotion, barking dogs, the distant calls of search parties setting out into the woods. I wondered if they'd found Chloe, or if she'd vanished completely into the wilderness, the siren's scream still echoing in her throat. One anxious agent pacing the hallway muttered something about that poor girl, and how she'd taken out 3 of them already. Had Chloe, possessed, become a threat to the agents themselves? Or had she turned her rage back on the cultists? By dawn, an agent I didn't recognize entered the room. He was younger, harder-edged, his eyes cold and assessing. Without a word, he unlocked my cuffs, the sudden freedom making my wrists ache. He escorted me outside to a waiting SUV, the air sharp and cold against my skin. He drove me in silence to the edge of the main road, the gas station a distant beacon of normalcy in the pre-dawn gloom. "Walk that way," he said, pointing, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "And don't speak to anyone about this. If you do, you'll regret it." Then, he drove off, leaving me alone on a deserted stretch of highway. No phone. Just the throbbing ache in my wrists, and the icy knot of fear in my stomach. I stumbled towards the gas station, the fluorescent lights buzzing like angry wasps. The clerk inside stared at me, wide-eyed, as I must have looked half feral, hair matted with dirt, face streaked with tears and dried blood. Using the clerk's phone, I tried to call Ethan's cell. No response. Chloe's went straight to voicemail. I had no one else. The clerk, bless his oblivious heart, let me sit outside, offering water and a granola bar, asking no questions, sensing, perhaps, that some stories were best left untold. I mumbled something about a car accident, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. My mind swam in confusion, fear, and a bone-deep weariness. I hitchhiked back to Portland, praying, against all reason, that Ethan was alive, safe. Over the next few days, I became a ghost in my own life, haunting local news stations, scouring online reports. Nothing, no mention of any cult, no whisper of missing hikers near Shadow Creek Falls. The area was, officially, quiet as ever. Emails and texts to Ethan remained unanswered, swallowed by the digital void. When I tried contacting local hospitals, no one would confirm he was ever a patient. A week later, driven by a desperate need for something solid, something real, I visited Ethan's apartment. Empty, stripped bare. His landlord, a gruff, unsympathetic man, said Ethan had terminated his lease, unexpectedly. The very day I'd returned from Shadow Creek Falls. My blood ran cold. Impossible. Ethan had been unconscious, barely clinging to life that night. He couldn't have signed papers, made phone calls. Someone was covering their tracks, erasing him. The agents, it had to be them. In the months that followed, I tried to track Chloe as well, a phantom pursuit in the digital age. She'd vanished. No word to her family. Social media profiles frozen, abandoned mid-scroll. It was as if she'd never existed. I found a single, fleeting mention in an obscure online forum, buried deep in a thread about paranormal events near Shadow Creek Falls, a post describing a Possessed woman running wild in the forest. It had been immediately flagged, scrubbed, leaving behind only a whisper in the digital void. I wish I could say I moved on, that I healed from the betrayal, the terror. But sleep is a fragile ally. My nights haunted by the final image of Chloe's eyes rolling back, that guttural cry ripping from her throat. Night after night, I wake in a cold sweat, the siren's unearthly wail echoing in my dreams. I still see Ethan's pained expression, the confusion, the dawning regret in his fading eyes. There are moments, in the dead quiet of the night, when a darker thought takes root. I wonder, had Ethan been in contact with that cult before we arrived? Enticed by the thrill of real danger, real secrets. He had mentioned, listening to them, in his delirium, those last, broken words before he slipped away. Maybe he never intended for Chloe or me to be harmed. Maybe he wanted to harness the power of the legend he'd read about, to carve out some twisted, dangerous name for himself. I can only guess. The final, brutal blow he suffered at Chloe's possessed hand left too many questions unanswered. A gaping wound in the fabric of my understanding. What I do know, with chilling certainty, is that this wasn't just some local myth, some campfire story. Something real, something malignant, lurks in those forests, feeding on human fear, human blood, and an organized group, powerful enough to silence witnesses, manipulate reality itself, hovers around it, whether they serve it, study it, or simply seek to control it. I can't say. But they are willing to do anything to keep it hidden. Sometimes, I sit in my apartment, listening to the distant hum of city traffic, remembering how the wind sounded through the pines near Shadow Creek Falls. If I close my eyes, I can almost see the torrent of water, taste the metallic tang of fear in the air, sense Seraphina's presence, a cold breath on the back of my neck. That final, unnerving wail remains lodged in my bones, an echo of ancient sorrow, ancient rage. A few weeks ago, a plain, unmarked envelope arrived in the mail, inside a single photograph, Ethan, smiling faintly, sitting upright in what looked like a sterile hospital room. The photo had no return address, no note, no explanation. Was it a warning? We're watching you, stay silent. Or a twisted glimmer of hope, he's alive. But he's ours now. I can't be certain. The only thing I know for sure is that this story, my story, is bigger, darker than I ever imagined. If you ever go to Shadow Creek Falls, if you ever find yourself hearing whispers of a siren named Seraphina, or see strange, like runes carved into trees, turn back. Don't let the waterfall's roar drown out your good sense. Don't linger when the sun sets. Because some legends aren't just folklore, and sometimes the worst monsters wear human faces, hidden behind badges, behind masks of authority. I'm Ava Carter, and that is everything I can bear to recount. Whether you believe me or not, I beg you to remember this: secrets are kept for a reason. And some places hide secrets too dangerous for any of us to face alone. Above all else, if you hear the siren's wail on the wind, run. Because the next scream just might be your own. Nights in Blackwood National Park had been dead quiet lately, but tonight felt different the second I walked into the Redwood Station Ranger office. Dispatch already had 4 calls stacked. All vacation cabins getting hit. People just don't get it about this place. They build these fancy cabins out here, thinking the wildlife is gonna respect their property lines. Like, oh, my bad, Didn't realize this was human turf. Yeah, right. This is a massive park, and these animals were here first. They've never been hunted, never scared by anything except maybe a bigger predator. City folks think it's a peaceful escape for them. But guess what? It's a 5-star buffet for every wild thing with teeth and claws. I jumped in my beat, up Ranger truck, heading to the first call. Some older couple, the Harrisons, had a real close encounter with a deer. Apparently, it had smashed right through their patio doors. They'd managed to trap it in the guest bedroom and needed someone to come get it out. Lucky me, right? When I got to the Harrisons' cabin, they looked like deer caught in headlights themselves, no pun intended. Totally freaked out. Adrenaline was still pumping through them. I got them calmed down enough to move to another room, told them to lock the door tight. Safety first, always. Once they were safe, I checked the nearest exit, swung the back door wide open, then took a deep breath and went to the guest bedroom. Slowly, I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me first, thick, metallic. Blood. The room was soaked in it, like a slaughterhouse. The deer was just lying there on the floor, gasping for air. I moved in slow, keeping the doorway clear, giving it a way out. But the closer I got, the more I knew this deer wasn't going anywhere. Its entire side was ripped open, claw marks everywhere. Coyote was my first thought, but these marks were way too wide. Big enough for a bear, maybe, but the claw marks were too spread out. Too wrong. It looked like something out of a horror movie, like Freddy Krueger had taken a swipe at it. The deer's eyes went wide as I got closer, but it didn't even try to stand. Bad sign. Its breath was ragged, shallow. I had to see the other side, so I wrestled to roll it over. And then it was my turn to feel like I couldn't breathe. Its flank was just gone, torn to shreds. But it got worse. Chunks of meat were just missing. I leaned in, checked the wounds closer. Bite marks. Huge bite marks where flesh should have been. If I didn't know better, if it wasn't completely insane, I'd have sworn it was bitten by a shark. Blood was still pouring out, and the poor thing was dying, every breath a struggle. I backed out of the room, left it to die in peace. Went back in a few minutes later, and it was still dead. I snapped some pictures with my phone, then did my best to drag the carcass out to the truck without making more of a bloodbath in the cabin. Got it loaded, then went back inside to talk to the vacationers. I opened the door to the room they were hiding in, and the woman's eyes went wide as dinner plates. She screamed, a sound that could shatter glass. The man's eyes were bugging out too. I moved towards them slowly, hands up, trying to calm them down. It had the opposite effect. They scrambled back, climbing on furniture, clawing at the walls to get away from me. I backed off, gave them space. "What's wrong?" I asked, totally confused. The man pointed a shaky finger right at me. "Why, you're covered in blood," he stammered. "The deer got you?" the woman shrieked. "You've got rabies. Or worse," the man added, keeping a safe distance. Hey, it's okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "This is the deer's blood. I promise. You killed it. Just for breaking in," the woman accused, her voice still trembling. "What? No. It was already almost dead. I just moved it to my truck." They seemed to relax a little, actually listening now. "So you don't have rabies?" the man asked slowly, still looking me up and down like I was contagious. or anything else. The woman chimed in, peeking out from behind her husband. No, Mom. I'm fine. Really. She took another long look, probably checking for bite marks or something. Finally, seeming convinced, they asked the one question I was dreading. So, what did kill the deer? The man asked, his voice barely a whisper. I honestly don't know, I said, which was the truth. After finally getting them calmed down, the last thing I wanted to do was send them spiraling back into panic. Probably just a coyote. I lied, going for the most normal thing I could think of. A coyote. The man repeated, his eyes widening again, like he was ready to jump right back into full-blown panic. Or a bear, I added, immediately regretting it as I watched their faces. Calming them down was clearly a lost cause. Look, you've been through a lot tonight, I said, trying a different approach. I can't tell you what to do, but if it were me, I'd. We're leaving, the woman declared, grabbing her husband's arm and practically dragging him out of the room. Sounds like a good idea, I agreed. And then, like an idiot, I added, hope you enjoyed your stay. They either didn't hear me or just ignored me completely. Either way, it wasn't long before I heard a car engine start and then speed away from the cabin. I went back to the guest bedroom, started backtracking, trying to figure out what had happened. Wasn't hard to follow the trail. The deer had blood everywhere. Bite marks and claw marks made it clear what had gone down. I tracked back through the living room, kitchen, out the smashed patio door. Once I was outside, I flipped on my flashlight. The trail was a little harder to see in the dark, but still pretty obvious. I could still see drops of blood next to the deer tracks, leading towards the lake behind the cabin. I approached the lake, and yeah, there it was, signs of a struggle. This had to be where the attack happened. There were other tracks mixed in with the deer's, but they didn't make any sense. They were huge, way too big, and the shape was just weird. If I had to describe them, I'd say they looked like duck prints, but giant, way bigger than any duck I'd ever seen. A giant duck with shark teeth. Yeah, I'm definitely leaving that out of the official report, I thought to myself. Then it clicked. Those weren't duck prints. They were swim fins. Footprints of someone wearing swim fins. But why? Why go through all that trouble to poach a deer? Why not just use a tranquilizer gun, or even a rifle? My mind offered up an answer, and I really didn't like it. What if it's some kind of psycho? Just getting his kicks by killing an animal with his bare hands or, well, maybe not bare hands. But still. I thought about the state mental hospital in the next county. Wondered if someone had wandered off without permission, and they were trying to keep it quiet. I really didn't like that thought. For one thing, it didn't explain those massive bite marks on the deer. And for another, it meant we had someone out there who might suddenly decide to kill something bigger. I glanced back at the cabin, wondering how many vacationers were within easy walking distance of this lake. How many of them were armed. Lost in thought about everyone's safety, I heard something behind me. Whipped around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. Scanned the lake, and there it was, the ripples spreading out from the middle of the water. Probably just a fish jumping, I told myself, trying to ignore the chill crawling up my spine. I took a few more pictures of the struggle area with my phone. then started heading back to the truck. More calls to answer, and this weird mystery would have to wait. Drove halfway around Crystal Lake. Must have been 3 miles or so to the next cabin with a reported break-in. When the woman opened the door, maybe in her 30s, she took a step back, eyes wide. "Oh my God," she said, staring at the dried blood all over my uniform. "Evening, Mom." "Sorry about the look," I said, giving her my best ranger, trying to be reassuring smile. "You reported a break-in." "Wes, we did." "Please come in," she said, sounding polite enough, but still giving me a wide berth as she closed the door behind me. She led me upstairs to the kitchen. For some reason, I was expecting another bloodbath like the Harrisons' place. But this was different. Messy, but different. She pointed to the back door. It had been forced open, but not smashed to pieces like the last one. Just a small bit of glass broken near the handle. The door latch had been jimmied, and then the door slid right open. Smart, but still definitely a break-in. And then I saw them again, faint prints of those giant duck tracks, just like at the Harrisons. My blood ran cold. This cabin was over 3 miles away from the other one. 3 miles? That's a long way to travel. Especially if you're trying to be sneaky. And it meant there were a whole lot more cabins in between, any of which could be next. The woman showed me around the rest of the kitchen, the mess left behind. A few cans of sardines had been opened and eaten, same with some tuna. Seafood lover, it seemed. But the weird thing was how they were opened. The cans were ripped apart, torn into with something sharp, but definitely not a can opener. The marks, they looked like they were made by claws. Seriously strong claws. I shuddered, trying not to imagine the strength it would take to do that to a metal can. And then I saw it. Next to one of the tuna cans, a small puddle of blood. Not nearly as much as at the Harrisons, but still blood. "Ma'am, could I trouble you for a sandwich bag?" I asked. She blinked, a little surprised, but handed me one without question. I carefully scraped up as much of the blood as I could into the baggie, sealed it, and slipped it into my pocket. Evidence. Then I went out through the broken door to take a look around outside. Just like at the Harrisons, there was a lake behind the cabin. I followed those weird tracks back towards it, and just like before, they disappeared right at the water's edge. Vanished. I shined my flashlight over the lake, but all I saw was a turtle poking its head out of the water. A lone turtle. I stared at it for a long moment, like it was gonna suddenly give me a clue or something. Stupid, I know. "What should we do?" The woman's voice startled me, nearly made me jump out of my skin. Didn't even hear her follow me outside. "I'll send someone by in the morning to fix that door," I said, trying to sound professional, like I had any idea what was going on. In the meantime, might not be a bad idea to sleep in a room with a lock on the door. They'll be back, but just in case, you know. She didn't look too comforted by that idea, but she thanked me as I left. Said she appreciated. I just nodded and headed back to my truck, feeling more confused than ever. The next 2 calls were just teenagers, classic break-ins for beer. Nothing weird, no blood, no giant duck tracks. Just kids being kids, even if they were delinquent kids. At least it was normal. I went back to Redwood Station, changed out of my bloody uniform, finally, and spent the rest of the night filling out reports, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Didn't make much sense on paper either. When my shift ended and I filled in the day crew about the weirdness, I decided to take a little detour to the next county over. Stopped in at the Crestview Mental Hospital first, asked if they'd had any, unauthorized departures lately. The nurse at the front desk looked at me like I'd asked her if the sky was purple. "We don't have escapes," she said, all puffed up with pride, which just came off as pure arrogance. "Right." I thanked her and left, feeling less than satisfied with her answer. Then I swung by the county police department, talked to a buddy of mine on the force, Detective Miller. Asked if they could run a quick analysis on that blood sample for me. Played up the mental hospital escapee angle. Said the blood might help ID him, track him down. Didn't mention the shark, bite deer, or giant duck tracks. Baby steps. It was way past noon by the time I finally crawled into bed. That night, when I got to work, it was pure chaos. More break-ins. People were starting to freak out. Word was spreading like wildfire. The resort owner, Mr. Sterling, was in full panic mode. People were canceling reservations left and right, demanding refunds. When I walked in, he stormed right up to me, face red and puffy. "You told people to go home." He fumed, glaring up at me like I was personally responsible for the whole mess. I merely suggested, "You gonna pay for their rentals out of your ranger salary?" "I work for the park service, not you," I pointed out, trying to keep my voice even. He just turned an even deeper shade of red, if that was even possible. "Look, would you rather deal with a few cancellations, or have people turning up dead instead of deer?" I said, trying to appeal to his, well, if not his humanity, at least his business sense. Body count wouldn't be great for business, now would it? He went fire engine red, sputtered something about "Quill C," and stormed off. Dramatic exit, gotta give him that. I ended up investigating 5 more break-ins that night. Only 2 were legit. The rest seemed staged. Half attempts to fake a break-in so they could get out of their rentals without paying. People are unbelievable sometimes. The 2 real ones were the same pattern as before. Just enough broken window to reach in and unlock the door. Cans of whatever seafood they could find. This time they even got into someone's freezer, made off with shrimp. Everything about it screamed person. Just had to figure out who. Again, I followed the tracks from the latest break-in back to the nearest lake. Stood there for a long time, just staring at the still water. I knew these lakes, they were all pretty much the same. Square-ish. Maybe 40 yards by 40, 5 feet deep in the middle, stocked with trout for fishing. Nothing special. Anyone using these lakes to hide would have to be holding their breath for, like, superhuman amounts of time. I stared at the surface for a good 20 minutes. If someone was out there, they had an invisible snorkel or an extra set of lungs. That's for sure. After my rounds of reports and head scratching, I decided to do a little extra investigating. Ran home, grabbed my swim trunks, mask, snorkel, and went back to the site of the most recent break-in. Lake, diving time. Waded into the water, instantly regretting wearing shorts as some kind of water snake slithered right past my leg. Let it go. Kept wading until I was deep enough to swim. Hovered at the surface, dipping my mask under, trying to get a better look at, well, something. Not much to see. Fish, weeds, murky water. Just your average lake. Kept swimming towards the middle, water getting deeper. Couldn't touch bottom anymore. Had to float on the surface. And then I saw it, a dark spot on the bottom, right in front of me. Looked like a rock, but something about it made me want to check it out. In for a penny, in for a pound, I thought, took a deep breath, and dove down to see what it was. As I got close to the dark spot, hovering right above it, I realized it wasn't a rock at all. Something about the shape, the way it just sat there in the murk. I took another deep breath, filled my lungs, and dove down for a real look. The further I swam down, the deeper I seemed to go. Seriously, this lake was way deeper than it should have been. Light started to fade fast. Pretty soon, it was getting dark, murky green water all around. I was sure I'd been swimming straight down for a solid minute, maybe more, and still hadn't hit bottom. I stopped, turned, and looked up. The surface of Crystal Lake, the sunlight, just a tiny pinprick of light way above me. My lungs started burning, screaming at me to turn around, get back to the surface. No choice but to listen. I kicked, started clawing at the water, desperate to get back up. But something felt wrong. It was like swimming in thick mud. Or something was pulling me down. Yeah, that's what it felt like, a force, a current, pushing against me, trying to drag me down. Keep me from escaping whatever was hidden down there. Crazy thought, I know, but that's what it felt like. Felt like forever. Fighting that weird resistance, but finally, I broke through the surface, gasped in a huge lungful of air. Swam over to the shallows. Practically crawled out of the lake, and just collapsed on the bank, lying there for a long time, trying to get my breath back. Once my brain started getting oxygen again, I tried to make sense of what just happened. Had that really been real? Or was it some kind of weird hallucination? Had I just gotten turned around underwater? Somehow gotten stuck at the bottom, panicking for no reason? I had to know for sure. Had to figure it out. No time to waste. I jumped in my truck, drove like crazy to the next town over, a couple counties away, and rented some real dive gear. Tank regulator, fins, the whole shebang, plus a good underwater light. Armed with proper equipment this time, I drove back to Blackwood, back to that lake. Walked right back out to the middle of the lake. No hesitation this time. When I dove down towards that dark spot again, things were different. With the dive light, I could actually see what was going on. Used the light to cut through the murky water, examine the darkness. And as I swam deeper, the sides really did close in on me. Like I was swimming down some kind of tunnel. Swimming down the throat of some massive beast, just like I'd thought before. Never been claustrophobic, not even a little. But that was changing fast. Barely any room to move, the sides closing in tighter and tighter. Thought about turning back, aborting this whole crazy idea, but there was just no room to maneuver, no space to turn around in that tight tunnel. Panic started to creep in, cold and sharp. Had to focus, keep my breath slow and steady, fight it back. I was right on the edge of a full-blown panic attack when, suddenly, the tunnel opened up again. The sides widened out, spreading further apart. Checked my dive watch, 15 minutes underwater already. Wow. The sides of the tunnel had spread out so far now, they were barely visible in the beam of my light. And ahead of me, I could see light. Real light, not just my dive light reflecting back. I swam towards it, desperate to get out of this underwater tunnel. Get out of the water, period. Broke through the surface, ripped off my mask, and looked around, and just stared. I was in the lake. Back in the same lake. Somehow I'd gotten completely turned around underwater, ended up right back where I started. Disoriented, confused, and more than a little freaked out. Swam to the side until I could stand, then just waded out of the lake, back onto the shore. Sat down hard, trying to wrap my head around what just happened. Looking around, taking in my surroundings, I suddenly realized, wait a minute. This was a lake. But not the same lake. Not the one I just dived into. This was the lake behind the other break, in cabin. The one 3 miles away. Somehow, impossibly, there was a hidden underwater tunnel connecting these two lakes. 3 miles apart. Underwater. That's how the robber never gets caught, I thought, mind racing. He just swims to the next lake, slick as snot. No fuss, no muss. I finally knew the how, but I still had no clue about the who. As tempting as it was to just jump right back in and swim back through that tunnel, I was still too shaken up. Didn't want to risk another underwater panic attack. Not yet. Walked back to my truck, peeled off the dive gear, and drove back to the dive shop. Figured maybe they'd have some local knowledge. Some idea who might be doing underwater excursions around here. Asked about frequent customers, especially anyone renting or refilling tanks a lot. They told me they had a few regulars who came in every weekend, but nobody new, and nobody refilling tanks more than once a week. Didn't fit the pattern. Asked if there were any other dive shops nearby. Nope. Next closest one was over 100 miles away. Strikeout. Went home, frustrated as hell. It just wasn't making sense. Whoever, whatever, was doing this, they'd have to need air to swim back and forth through that tunnel. And that tunnel, that had to be their escape route. Had to be. Tried to sleep through the afternoon, but my brain just wouldn't shut off. Kept working on that impossible puzzle. How the heck was this robber getting air? That afternoon, sleep was a total waste of time. My brain was stuck in overdrive, replaying that dive, that tunnel, the whole insane situation. Kept going over and over it. How was the air thing working? It just didn't make any damn sense. Finally, an idea sparked. I grabbed a couple of trail cams from Redwood Station. Figured I'd set them up at each lake. Needed to see if this guy, or whatever it was, had some kind of crazy new tank system, some way to get air underwater without surfacing. And yeah, I really wanted to get a clear picture, ID this thing, and shut it down fast. Made sure to stay away from those lakes that night, give him space to operate. Let him think he was in the clear. Next morning, before sunrise, I went to collect the cameras, took them home, and started downloading the memory cards. Just as the second download finished, my phone rang. Caller ID, Detective Miller. My buddy from the county police. Blood test results. Hello. I answered, hitting play on the computer. Video from the first trail cam starting to load. Hey Jake, it's Miller. Got those blood results you asked for the other day. Great, I said, eyes glued to the screen as a blurry, ghostly green image flickered to life on my computer. Were you able to match it to any hospital records? Anything like that? Not exactly. Why not? I asked, clicking to the next video file, the second trail cam footage. And then I froze, staring at the screen, completely speechless. Well, the thing is, Miller said, his voice a little hesitant. The blood you gave me, it came back as reptile DNA. Reptile DNA. The words hit my ears, just like the image on the screen hit my eyes. But my brain just short-circuited. Couldn't process it. Couldn't connect them to reality. Standing there, large as life on my computer screen, wasn't a dude in a wetsuit. It was a creature. I could see the wide mouth, stretched open in a silent snarl, full of rows and rows of razor-sharp teeth, teeth that looked exactly like the bite marks on that deer. I saw the webbed feet, yeah, like swim fins, but with nasty-looking claws sticking out where toes should be. Saw the same kind of razor claws on its webbed hands. Full on nightmare fuel, staring right back at me from my laptop. "You there, Jake?" Miller's voice snapped me back to the phone call. "Yet sorry," I mumbled, still staring at the screen. Reptile DNA, you said?" "Yeah," Miller confirmed. "Weird, right? Definitely not human. Not any kind of animal we got around here either. Lizard, maybe. Something big anyway." "Yeah," I said again, my mind still racing. "Could you send a copy of your findings to my office? The official report." "Sure, no problem. Fax it over right now. Thanks, Miller. Really appreciate it. You really helped me figure this out." Understatement of the century. "Anytime, Jake," he said, sounding cheerful, before hanging up. But I hadn't taken my eyes off the computer screen the whole time we were talking. No matter how long I stared at it, I just couldn't make my brain accept it as real. Standing there, clear as day in blurry night vision, was not some escaped mental patient. It was a monster. I finally sat back hard in my chair and just thought. For a long time. Then, I printed out copies of those trail cam images, stuck them in an envelope with Miller's lab report. Time to go to work. Rushed to Redwood Station, practically burst through the door, ready to share this insane information with the other rangers. Started showing them the pictures, the report. Faces around the room went from shock to disbelief. Yeah, some of them were just plain mocking me. Rangers, tough guys, right? Monsters weren't in the job description. Just as I was trying to explain, trying to make them understand this wasn't some joke, Sterling, the resort owner, walks in. Perfect timing. "What's all this then?" he says, eyeing me with that usual look of pure contempt. "Seems like Jake here has solved the break-in case." One of the other rangers, Brody, says, a smirk playing on his lips. Still didn't believe me. Sterling waddles over, picks up the lab report, scans it, then stares for a long time at the picture of the creature. Silence in the room. You know what this is," he says finally, his voice almost empty, like he was talking to himself. "I really don't know what it is yet," I said, trying to keep it calm. "Never seen anything like it." He turns to me and then, weirdly, he smiles. A big, greasy, money-hungry smile. "This," he says, holding up the picture like it was a winning lottery ticket. "This is money." "What do you mean?" I asked, totally lost. "Those idiots. You know, the ones who go around hunting, what do they call them?" "Cryptid hunters," Brody offered, still smirking. "Yeah, cryptids." Sterling practically shouts, getting all worked up. "Those guys will pay anything if they think they can find something like this. And then there's the TV shows, the merchandise." He's practically drooling now. "You might have just saved my financial ass," Ranger Jake, beaming at me like I'd just handed him a gold bar. "Mr. Sterling," I said, trying to get through to him. "I don't think you understand. This is a dangerous animal. If you'd seen what it did to that deer. So what? You want to hunt it down, kill it. Maybe not kill it, but definitely tranquilize it. Get it somewhere safe. Somewhere it can't hurt anyone. You dumb son of a bitch. He explodes, face turning purple again. I could make a fortune off this. I wouldn't even have to fix those broken cabins. They'd all rush in here, desperate to see it. Leave piles of cash in my bank account. Spooked. What about the people? I asked, voice rising. Who cares about the people? He yells. Throw 'em all out. I've got the chance of a lifetime knocking on my front door. And you want to flush it down the toilet because you're scared someone might break a nail. He was breathing hard, veins popping out on his forehead, just staring up into my face, pure rage pouring off him. And then, just as suddenly, a weird calm came over him. Creepy calm. Brody, he says, turning to the lead ranger, voice suddenly smooth as oil. Isn't this a wildlife preserve? Wes, sir, it is. Brody says, looking worried now, like he's finally realizing Sterling's gone off the rails. And isn't the wildlife on this preserve protected? By law, from all tampering? Well, I guess so, Brody says slowly. What if those animals present a threat? One I jumped in. One mapu do reddit. Com do go good. Com Sterling just laughs, a short nasty sound. How many deer were killed by coyotes on this preserve last year? Ranger Brody. Dozens, at least. Brody answers, still watching Sterling like he's a bomb about to go off. Were the coyotes removed from the preserve? Sterling asks, all fake innocent. No sir, Brody says, finally getting where Sterling's going with this. Sterling turns back to me, shoots me this triumphant, sickeningly sweet smile. See, Ranger Jake, nature taking its course, circle of life and all that. Brody clears his throat, looks at me, then back at Sterling. Jake, Brody says, I know you've got everyone's best interests at heart, but you're gonna have to let this go. I just stared at him, then at Sterling, then back at Brody. And what happens, I said, my voice low and tight, when this thing decides it likes to eat humans? Suddenly, every pair of eyes in the room that had been on me shifted, found somewhere else to look, every pair except Sterling's. He was still grinning, ear to ear. I swear, the pudgy little bastard was about to break out into a happy dance. I scanned the room, searching for any sign of support, any flicker of understanding. Found nothing, just blank faces, or worse, faces agreeing with Sterling. Without another word, I reached up, pulled my ranger badge off my shirt, laid it quietly on Brody's desk, and walked out. If that was the end of the story, I'd say I'd failed, big time. But it wasn't the end, not yet. I took my pension, cashed it out, and rented one of the vacation cabins on the preserve. The same preserve I'd just quit protecting. Sterling, the genius, had leaked the cryptid story all over social media. Just like he'd predicted, the cryptid hunters, the TV crews, the whole circus came pouring in, renting every cabin in sight. Chaos, but it was a different kind of chaos now. My goal was different from theirs. I didn't need to hunt it, didn't need to prove it existed. I already knew. And I knew how it moved around, how it stayed hidden. My goal was to keep people safe. And maybe, just maybe, keep the creature safe too. I stayed in one of the break-in cabins, right by Crystal Lake. Every night, I bought a huge, fresh tuna from town, laid it out by the edge of the water, near those fin tracks. Then I'd sit in the dark living room, watch. First night, it approached the fish, cautious, more curious than hungry. Sniffed it for a long time, then finally grabbed it, dove back into the lake. Night after night, same routine. I'd leave a fish. The creature would come, get bolder each time. It was being fed. And the media frenzy. It was starving. Hunters were finding nothing. No sightings. As long as I kept feeding it, nothing happened. Everyone was out there with their cameras, their spotlights, their ridiculous creature calling howls. But they were all looking in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions. The few hunters that actually got close to the cabins, they mostly left me alone when they saw someone in the windows. Figured I was just another cryptid hunter, respecting my privacy. Idiots. As the sightings stayed at zero, the hunters, the TV crews, they started turning on Sterling, calling him a fraud, a liar. His reputation, what little he had left, plummeted. After a week of nothing, people started packing up, leaving, desperate. Sterling did the dumbest thing could do, hired some actor to dress up in a cheap monster suit, roam around the woods, try to fake a sighting. Of course, the real hunters, the TV shows, they saw right through it in about 5 seconds. Completely destroyed what was left of Sterling's reputation. Serves him right. I'd rented the cabin for 2 weeks. Between the rent, the gas, and buying a giant tuna every single night, my money was running out fast. I'd managed to keep the people safe, for now. But what would happen when I had to leave? What would happen when the feeding stopped? I'd cleared out most of the vacationers. Yeah, they were probably safe. But what about the few locals who lived closer to the preserve? What about my ex-coworkers? The rangers still working for Sterling? What would happen when it got desperate? When the creature no longer had cabins full of easy food to break into? I didn't have the answer, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let Sterling turn this creature into a sideshow attraction. And I wasn't going to let anyone else become its prey. My pension might be running out, but my fight was just getting started. My name is Ethan Blackwood, and I'm 42 years old. What happened last October in a secluded corner of Montana's Blackwood Valley still haunts me. Until everything spiraled into nightmare. I genuinely believed this trip would be our sanctuary, a peaceful escape into the mountains, a chance for my wife, Sarah, and me to reconnect, far from the relentless pulse of city life. I'd meticulously planned this getaway for months, poring over Forest Service road maps, obsessively checking weather forecasts for a region notorious for its volatile mountain weather. Sarah and I had been married for almost a decade. Life in Seattle had devolved into a soul-crushing routine of endless workdays and a constant barrage of distractions. We booked a rustic, slightly dilapidated cabin nestled in the foothills of the imposing peaks. For me, this was more than just a vacation. I envisioned capturing the raw, untamed spirit of the wilderness for a travel memoir I was itching to write. Sarah, bless her heart, simply craved respite from the daily grind, drawn to the promise of utter isolation. We arrived just as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges on a Saturday, our car crawling along a dirt road that snaked through a cathedral of towering evergreens. The cabin itself was perched in a small clearing, encircled by pines and spruce, their dark shapes looming like silent, watchful sentinels. It was the kind of place that radiated tranquility, yes, but also hummed with an unsettling undercurrent, something vaguely ominous. I tried to dismiss it as an overactive imagination. Our first evening unfolded quietly. It was too brisk to sit outside for long, but we lit a fire in the old wood stove, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and settled in with a bottle of wine. We talked about our tentative plans, lazy mornings, short hikes in the crisp autumn air, the fragile hope that this retreat might reignite the spark that city life had so relentlessly dimmed. The second morning dawned with a mountain chill that was sharp but invigorating. We decided to explore the nearest town, a mere speck on the map nestled in the valley. It was less a town, more a scattering of buildings, a general store, a greasy spoon diner, and a couple of quaint, family-run shops. While Sarah browsed the general store for forgotten supplies, I found myself in conversation with a local man. He was the archetypal rugged outdoorsman, clad in worn flannel and denim, weathered face framed by a thick, untamed beard. He introduced himself as Jedediah, but everyone just called him Jedstone. He carried an air of restless energy, like a caged animal barely containing itself. "You two folks staying out here for long?" he asked, his eyes the color of faded denim, assessing me. "About a week," I replied, "been up in the foothills." He nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "Beautiful area," he conceded, then his voice dropped a register, becoming gravelly. "It is, but be careful. These woods, they can be strange." I remember smiling politely, chalking it up to local color, a harmless attempt to spook the tourists. But Jed pressed on, undeterred. "They say there's something old in these forests. I've seen things out here that curdle your blood." He fixed me with a cryptic stare, almost daring me to ask for more. Before I could formulate a response, Sarah rejoined me, a wicker basket laden with groceries swinging from her arm. Jed just shrugged, gave us a curt nod, and then leapt off, disappearing into the sleepy quiet of the town. As we walked back to the car, Sarah and I chuckled about the encounter, dismissing it as small town folklore, the kind of yarn spun to entertain and maybe slightly intimidate outsiders. But a sliver of unease had taken root in me. I couldn't quite shake the intensity in Jed's eyes, the unsettling conviction in his voice. Back at the cabin that evening, Sarah busied herself cooking pasta, the comforting aroma filling the small space, while I attempted to organize my scattered notes for the memoir. Every now and then, the wind would tear through the dense trees surrounding the cabin, creating a low, mournful moan that seemed to press against the very walls. We ate dinner in relative silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind's persistent sigh. Later, as I was rinsing dishes in the small sink, Sarah gently touched my shoulder. She pointed towards the window, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. Through the condensation-streaked glass, I thought I glimpsed a flicker of movement, a fleeting shadow. Just a figure, or perhaps just the distorted reflection of our own lamplit cabin. Driven by a prickle of unease, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night air was bitingly cold, the darkness absolute, the silence profound. I swept the beam of light across the yard, the edge of the tree line. No footprints marred the damp earth, no twigs snapped under an unseen foot. Nothing, and yet I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the distinct feeling of being watched. Paranoid. I muttered to myself, trying to reason away the feeling. Sarah wrapped in a thick shawl when I returned inside, teased. Maybe it was the ghost Jedidiah warned us about. We forced a laugh, trying to lighten the growing tension. But I noticed the subtle shift in Sarah. She double-checked the door lock with unnecessary care before we went to bed. I suspect neither of us wanted to admit we were genuinely spooked. But the feeling was there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. The next day, determined to shake off the cabin fever and the creeping dread, we opted for a modest hike on a trail that traced the winding river. The scenery was undeniably breathtaking, golden aspen leaves shimmering in the breeze, the constant, soothing rush of icy water, the forest floor cushioned by a soft carpet of fragrant pine needles. Sarah and I were engrossed in taking photographs, trying to capture the postcard beauty, when we both noticed it. The forest had fallen utterly, eerily silent. The usual background symphony of chirping birds, rustling squirrels, the gentle hum of life, had vanished, leaving behind a vacuum of sound. Not even 2 minutes later, the silence was broken by a distinct crunch of leaves behind us. We spun around, hearts hammering, expecting maybe a deer, or even another hiker. But there was only emptiness. Just the dense, silent trees staring back at us. About an hour into the hike, we heard it again. Footsteps. Unmistakable, deliberate, human footsteps. They kept pace with ours. A steady rhythm in the otherwise silent woods. Each time we paused, they stopped. Each time we resumed walking, they started again. Always just slightly behind us, always hidden, just beyond the dense screen of trees. Sarah tried to offer reassurances, more for herself, I suspected, than for me. Probably just another hiker, she said, her voice a little too high, maybe shy, or cautious about encountering strangers. But the tension was a tangible thing now, coiling tighter with every step. We cut our hike brutally short, abandoning the scenic trail and practically running back to the perceived safety of the cabin. That night, a palpable agitation hung in the air between us. We tried to distract ourselves with the mundane rituals of cooking dinner, reading, anything to avoid acknowledging the growing dread. I decided to step outside for a moment of forced fresh air before bed, hoping the cold night might clear my head. The moon was surprisingly bright, casting long, stark shadows and illuminating patches of the yard in silver light. As I looked towards the dark, looming tree line, I swear to God, I saw it, a silhouette, shaped exactly like me. My height, my build, even the way the figure stood, with that slight, almost imperceptible slump in the shoulders, exactly how I stand when I'm tired, lost in thought. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I flicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, and the shape vanished. Gone. I frantically scanned the yard, the tree line, the shadows. Nothing. I half convinced myself it had been a trick of the moonlight, a play of shadows, nothing more. But a small, insistent voice at the back of my mind kept screaming, cold and sharp, that was you. The next morning, I tried to push aside the growing apprehension, to bury it under a veneer of normalcy. But I couldn't help myself. I told Sarah what I'd seen in the yard the night before. She looked genuinely concerned, more so than she let on. But she insisted it was likely just an overactive imagination, fueled by Jed's local legend ramblings and the unsettling atmosphere of the woods. Desperate to find some rational explanation, or at least to not feel so utterly isolated, we made a plan to visit the town again. Maybe we could glean more information from the locals, find some grounding in the mundane. While Sarah browsed for an extra blanket at the general store, I found myself face to face with Jed Stone once more. "You folks settling in okay?" he asked, that same unsettling intensity in his gaze. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to confide in him, to test the waters. I told him about our unsettling hike, the footsteps in the woods, the figure I thought I'd seen in the yard at night. As I spoke, Jed's weathered face turned grim, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I've heard tell of something like that before," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "A shadow in the forest that follows you, but isn't quite you. Some folks call it a doppelganger. Old native legends mention it. Whatever name you give it. This valley, it has its share of strangeness." He paused, his gaze piercing. "Could someone be messing with us?" I asked, the question hanging in the air. Jed slowly shook his head. "Could be," he conceded, "but I suspect it's older than that. Listen." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered, dog-eared business card. "If you need a guide, a friend out there, let me know. Name's Jedediah Stone." He pressed the card into my hand. "I've been around these woods my whole life." Sarah found me a minute later, an extra blanket clutched in her arms. I repeated Jed's unsettling words to her. Though outwardly skeptical, I could see a flicker of worry in her eyes. That night, seeking a semblance of reassurance, a buffer against the encroaching darkness, I impulsively invited Jed back to the cabin for dinner. He arrived close to sundown, carrying a six-pack of local beer and wearing an odd expression. A mixture of morbid curiosity and something akin to dread, as if he was knowingly stepping into a place of danger. Over our simple meal of reheated pasta, Jed spun more stories, each one more unsettling than the last. Tales of people wandering into the forests, never to return. He claimed some vanished without a trace, swallowed by the wilderness, while others reappeared days, weeks later, acting strangely like empty shells of their former selves. Sarah tried valiantly to steer the conversation towards lighter topics, but I caught her stealing nervous glances at the darkened windows. At some point, Jed's stories drifted towards curses, ancient forest spirits, and, inevitably, doppelgangers. He concluded with a pronouncement that hung heavy in the fire-warmed cabin air. "Whatever it is, it might feed on conflict, on fear. So, keep your heads. Don't let it tear you apart." Just as the last word left his lips, a sharp, insistent knock echoed through the cabin. We all froze, exchanging tense, startled looks. No one else was expected. Jed moved to answer it, a hunting knife suddenly appearing in his calloused hand. But before he even reached the door, it creaked open, hinges groaning in protest. Standing in the doorway was a woman. Striking green eyes, a cascade of fiery red curls, and an unnervingly confident stance. She seemed oddly at ease, almost theatrical, for someone barging into a stranger's cabin unannounced. "Hey, sorry to intrude," she said, her voice a breezy contralto. "I knocked. But it's so quiet in here." Her voice trailed off as she finally seemed to register Jed's startled face, the tension radiating from us. "I'm Serafina Lawson." She introduced herself, Sarah Thorne. "I own the antique shop in town. Heard you had some questions about local legends." Her seemingly casual demeanor disarmed me for a moment. She claimed she'd been in the area, collecting wild herbs, a rather flimsy excuse considering the late hour and the isolated location, and decided to drop by. I wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation, or how she'd so easily found our secluded cabin. She laughed it off, saying, "Ward travels fast in a small town." She seemed a little too interested in our experiences, pressing for details about when I'd first seen my shadow. Her presence, while outwardly friendly, made me inexplicably uneasy. Something in the way her gaze flicked towards Jed, a subtle undercurrent of something, suggested a shared history between them, though whether it was good or bad, I couldn't decipher. After Sarah finally left, disappearing back into the darkness as abruptly as she'd arrived, Jed lingered by the door, watching the empty space where she'd stood. "Look," he said, his voice low and serious. "I didn't tell her anything. She's complicated. If I were you," he fixed me with a hard stare, "I'd be careful around her." We parted ways soon after. Sarah and I left with more questions than answers, a tangled web of unease and suspicion clinging to us tighter than ever. That night, sleep offered no escape, no respite. My mind relentlessly replayed the moment I'd seen that figure in the yard, the chillingly familiar silhouette, the near-perfect replication of myself. I found myself wondering, with a growing sense of dread, if it could have been just a lost hiker, a trick of the light, or something far, far more sinister. In the dead of night, a sound jolted me awake. Sarah was shaking me gently, her hand trembling against my shoulder. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the window, reflecting the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. "Ethan, did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. There it was again, a faint scraping noise, coming from somewhere near the porch. A cold dread washed over me, a feeling far more visceral than simple unease. I got out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, and walked to the door. Pressing my ear against the cold wood, I strained to listen. The sound came again, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like nails or claws dragging against the rough, hewn wood of the porch. Summoning a courage I didn't truly feel, I slowly, deliberately, unlatched the heavy bolt and opened the door a crack. Peering out into the inky blackness, I saw nothing. The porch was empty. The yard beyond, bathed in the eerie silver glow of the moon, was still and silent. Relief flickered through me, quickly extinguished by what I saw next. Muddy handprints, running across the porch railing, smudged and indistinct in the moonlight, but undeniably there. Handprints that looked eerily, unsettlingly familiar. Similar to my own. My breath hitched in my throat. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing too loudly in the stillness, and frantically bolted it again. I turned to Sarah, my voice barely a whisper. Handprints, muddy handprints on the railing, like mine. She was silent for a long moment, her face pale in the dim light, alarm widening her eyes. As dawn finally broke, painting the sky in pale streaks of grey and rose. Neither of us had slept much. Over strong, black coffee, we admitted the truth we'd both been avoiding. We needed answers. If the locals weren't forthcoming, then maybe we could find something in old records, archives. Anything to make sense of the escalating strangeness. The small town library, tucked away behind the general store, housed a modest collection of local history. We spent the morning there, sifting through dusty files, brittle newspaper clippings, and faded, handwritten diaries from the valley's frontier era. The silence of the library was heavy, broken only by the rustle of aged paper and the frantic beat of my own heart. One yellowed newspaper article, decades old, sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. It recounted local legends of a mirror man who haunted these woods. Whispers of unexplained disappearances attributed to its malevolent influence. Another, a handwritten account from a pioneer woman's diary, told of a mother's chilling claim that her son had returned from a camping trip in the Blackwood forests, not the same. He'd adopted habits, mannerisms, a coldness in his eyes that were utterly foreign to the boy she knew. By midday, we were both emotionally and physically exhausted, the growing sense of gloom in the library mirroring the oppressive atmosphere outside. We took a break at the town's only diner, seeking the false comfort of greasy food and lukewarm coffee, as if summoned by our increasingly desperate need for answers. Jed Stone walked in and joined us at our booth. He'd been doing his own digging, he explained, poking around, as he put it, and had gleaned more unsettling rumors from the town's old-timers. Whispers of spirits that could steal your shape, your very essence. He confided, his voice low and conspiratorial, that some locals believed a specific ritual, passed down through generations, might banish these entities, or at least offer some protection. I wasn't sure I believed in rituals, not really. But the raw desperation in Jed's voice, the genuine fear etched on his weathered face, made me consider anything, everything. While the three of us were hunched over the table, deep in hushed conversation, the diner door swung open again. Serafina Thorne breezed in, radiating an unsettling confidence. She slid into our booth uninvited, her presence filling the already tense space. She ordered a coffee, her striking green eyes flicking between Jed and me, a subtle, knowing smile playing on her lips. "You know," she began, stirring her coffee slowly, deliberately, "there are ways to appease this thing. Ways to keep it from fully binding itself to you." Sarah frowned, her skepticism finally breaking through her fear. "And how would you know that, Miss Thorne?" she asked, her voice sharp. Sarah gave a slight, enigmatic smile, ignoring Sarah's obvious distrust. "Call me Sarah, please. And I study the old legends, Mrs. Blackwood. I've spoken to enough folks who've lived here their whole lives. Some of them, they practice things. Rituals, rites, whatever you want to call them. Not all are pleasant, mind you." She paused, her green eyes glinting. "But some are necessary." A chill deeper than the autumn air settled over me. The way she'd said, "Not all are pleasant." It was too casual, too knowing, sending a shiver of unease down my spine. "We just want this to leave us alone," I murmured, the words feeling weak even to my own ears. Sarah shrugged, a dismissive gesture that somehow amplified my anxiety. "That's what everyone wants at first." Her insinuation set my teeth on edge, but beneath the irritation, a thread of morbid curiosity tugged at me. Nonetheless, she offered her help, even suggesting we meet her near a place called Shadow Creek Clearing the next afternoon. Local folklore, she explained, claimed the boundary between realities was thin there, almost porous. "You might see something that makes sense of all this," she said cryptically, her gaze intense, before finally rising and leaving as abruptly as she'd arrived. As Sarah walked away, Jed leaned closer, his voice urgent. "We need to be careful, Ethan. Real careful. Don't trust her. Not fully. He insisted we go prepared to this Shadow Creek clearing, just in case Sarah's intentions weren't as benevolent as she claimed. By this point, despite our initial reservations, Sarah and I found ourselves trusting Jed Stone more than the unnervingly enigmatic Serafina Thorne. That night, the dread was a suffocating blanket. We invited Jed to stay at the cabin. He arrived armed with his sleeping bag, a powerful flashlight, and a wickedly sharp hunting knife, setting up camp on the living room couch. His presence offered a fragile sense of security, a thin shield against the encroaching darkness, but it wasn't enough to truly quell the terror that had settled deep in my bones. At dawn, a fragile, pale light filtering through the pines, the three of us drove in tense silence towards Shadow Creek clearing. Jed, in the back seat, meticulously checked his hunting knife, the metallic snick of the blade opening and closing punctuating the heavy atmosphere in the car. The area was even more remote than the cabin, well off any marked trail. Shadow Creek clearing was unmarked, a small, unassuming meadow ringed by ancient, gnarled pines. The moment we stepped out of the car, an almost physical weight settled upon me. A suffocating sense of being watched, of unseen eyes boring into us from the surrounding woods. Serafina was already there, standing near the tree line, a figure of unsettling calm against the backdrop of the brooding forest. With her were 4 other people, strangers to me, locals perhaps, each wearing an expression that wavered between morbid fascination and palpable fear. Serafina beckoned us closer, her red hair vivid against the muted greens and browns of the clearing. "We're going to see if we can lure it out," she announced, her voice carrying an unnerving certainty. "Then we will confront it." My hand instinctively went to the small can of bear spray I'd brought, a pathetic gesture of defense against an enemy I couldn't even define. Something in the solemn, almost ritualistic expressions of Serafina's companions told me this was far more than just a spooky campfire story. I started to ask who these people were, what exactly we were about to do, but Serafina cut me off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Thee here to help, Ethan. That's all you need to know." Before I could protest further, the group began to chant. The words were foreign, guttural, ancient-sounding, echoing with an uncanny resonance in the small clearing. The air itself seemed to thicken, to turn viscous, and a sudden, biting cold descended, so intense I could see my breath misting in the air. Sarah instinctively took my hand, her fingers icy, and I felt her trembling beside me. Then, without warning, it stepped out of the trees. My first thought, a jolt of pure, unadulterated horror, it has my face. My second, even more chilling, it is me. Down to the last-minute detail. Same messy dark hair, same haunted blue eyes, same faint scar beneath my chin I'd carried since childhood. It stood there, in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, with that same slight slump in the shoulders, the posture I unconsciously adopted when exhausted or anxious. Sarah gasped beside me, a choked sound of terror, and I almost lost my grip on her hand. Jed stepped forward, his face ashen, his eyes locked on the figure. The chanting around us grew louder, more frenzied, a rising tide of sound. For a fleeting moment, I dared to hope the figure would vanish, dissipate back into the shadows as it had before. Instead, it moved, closer. A kind of chilling calm, a predatory malevolence, radiated from it. Then it spoke, in my voice, but twisted, distorted, laced with a cruel, mocking undertone. "You've called. It rasped, the familiar cadence utterly wrong. I've answered. Serafina and her group advanced, their movements precise, orchestrated, clearly enacting some pre-planned ritual. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. The creature, my creature, let out a guttural snarl, a sound that ripped through the chanting, and one of Serafina's companions screamed. In a blur of motion, the doppelganger lunged at the screaming man. He crumpled to the ground, choking, a strangled gurgle escaping his lips. Chaos erupted. The chanting faltered, then dissolved into panicked cries. People scrambled back, tripping over roots and fallen branches, fear turning the clearing into a scene of pandemonium. In the confusion, the creature, my shadow, self, darted back into the dense trees, disappearing as quickly and silently as it had appeared. Serafina rushed to the fallen man. He was unconscious, blood already welling up from a deep, ragged gash in his shoulder. "We need to follow it," she yelled, her voice sharp, urgent, cutting through the chaos. "It's not over." That was the moment the thin veil of denial finally tore away. This wasn't some hallucination, some shared delusion. This was real, a living, physical threat, capable of brutal violence. Jed grabbed my arm, his grip tight, his eyes wide with a primal fear I mirrored. "We should get out of here, Ethan. Now." But Serafina, her face pale but resolute, was unyielding. She insisted they continue the ritual, claiming, with a terrifying conviction, that we were close to subduing the entity. Sarah and I exchanged horrified glances. We couldn't just abandon these people, especially the injured man. But we were utterly out of our depth, trapped in a nightmare we couldn't comprehend. Then, from the edge of the clearing, two figures emerged from the trees, hooded, cloaked, men I hadn't noticed before. They moved with a chilling purposefulness. Their expressions were grim, hidden in shadow, but their eyes, when they glanced at us, held an unsettling, predatory focus. Before we could react, before we could even process what was happening, they moved. Fast. They shoved us apart, separating Jed and me. One pinned Jed to the ground with brutal efficiency, expertly binding his wrists behind his back with zip ties. The other lunged for me. I managed to twist away, adrenaline surging through my veins, but he was strong, relentless. Sarah screamed, a raw, desperate sound, begging them to stop. Only to have Serafina calmly, methodically restrain her, pressing a hand firmly over her mouth, silencing her cries. Then, Serafina turned to me, her green eyes cold, devoid of any trace of the breezy charm she'd displayed earlier. Her voice, though still calm, was now edged with steel, utterly chilling. "We need a sacrifice," she stated matter-of-factly, "to finish this." From the ground, Jed, struggling against his captor, roared, "Serafina, no! We can't have that." My mind reeled, trying to grasp the horrifying shift. Sacrifice. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. The ritual, the chanting, Serafina's unsettling calmness, the hooded figures, it had all been a trap. Serafina wasn't just a local antique shop owner curious about legends. She was part of this cult, working with others who believed some twisted offering was necessary to control, to appease, the doppelganger. My heart pounded with a terrifying mix of fury and icy dread. I lunged at the man holding Sarah, desperation giving me strength. We tumbled to the damp ground, rolling through the grass, a chaotic tangle of limbs. Sarah, seizing the momentary chaos, scrambled free. But two more figures, seemingly appearing from nowhere, instantly grabbed her, their movements swift, practiced. I heard Jed shouting, cursing, fighting against his bonds. Then, a sickening thud. I glanced over, my blood running cold, to see Jed slumped motionless on the ground. A trickle of blood snaking from his temple, staining the earth. They forced me to the ground next to Jed, pinning me down, binding my wrists with the same cruel zip ties. The chanting resumed, louder now, more frantic, a feverish drone that vibrated in the air, in my very bones. I saw Serafina rummaging in a worn leather backpack, pulling out a thick, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to escape, to fight, to get Sarah out of this nightmare. But the zip ties bit cruelly into my wrists, and the hooded figures were implacable, their weight crushing me. Sarah fought with furious desperation against the two robed figures holding her, her eyes wide with raw terror as she met mine. Then, the chanting reached a fever pitch, a crescendo of sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. And for a heartbeat, everyone froze. The creature, my doppelganger, stepped back into the clearing. A crooked, chilling grin twisted its features. It walked towards me, slowly, deliberately, its eyes gleaming with a malicious amusement that was directed solely at me. "You called," it repeated, the distorted echo of my own voice sending shivers down my spine. And I answered. It reached out, a hand that was disturbingly, impossibly mine, and ran it over my face. The touch was like ice burning cold, leaving a trail of gooseflesh in its wake. Then, it turned towards Serafina, as if waiting for its next command, its next victim. Serafina set the open book on a moss-covered tree stump, her voice rising in a chilling incantation, a language I couldn't place, ancient and guttural. The creature closed its eyes, almost as if entering a trance, submitting to her will. The tension in the clearing was suffocating, a palpable weight pressing down on us. Suddenly, Jed lurched awake with a gasp, his eyes snapping open. Blood dripped down his face, blurring his vision, but he reacted instantly, lashing out with a well-timed kick that caught the man holding him off guard. I seized the momentary distraction, rolling onto my side, my wrists burning as I twisted them against the tight zip ties. Sarah, with a surge of adrenaline, wriggled free from her captor's grasp. She grabbed a thick, broken branch lying on the ground and swung it with a desperate cry, striking the side of the second man's head. He crumpled, moaning, collapsing to the earth. I scrambled towards Jed, who was still struggling to break free. With one final, desperate effort, Sarah stomped on the plastic zip tie around his wrists, snapping it with a sharp crack. Jed snatched his hunting knife from his belt, his movement swift, decisive. He swiftly cut through my bindings, freeing my aching wrists. The robed figures, momentarily stunned, began to converge on us again, their chanting faltering. But we formed a shaky defensive triangle, Jed brandishing his knife, Sarah wielding the broken branch like a weapon. A surge of adrenaline, sharp and cold, overshadowed the lingering terror. Serafina shouted a command, her voice laced with fury, and the doppelganger lunged. For me, it moved with impossible speed, blurringly fast, far beyond anything human. Jed slashed wildly with his knife, managing to graze it, a thin red line appearing on its arm. The creature let out an unearthly shriek, a sound that clawed at my sanity, its eyes flashing with pure, incandescent hatred. In that split second, it seized Jed by the shoulder, its grip like iron, and I heard a sickening crunch as it drove him into the ground with brutal force. Jed yelled, a raw cry of agony, the hunting knife falling from his suddenly limp hand. I scrambled for the fallen knife, my fingers fumbling for the hilt, but one of Serafina's men tackled me from the side. We tumbled to the ground again, fists flying, a desperate, brutal struggle. He landed a hard punch that sent my ears ringing, the world momentarily blurring at the edges. Blood pounded in my head. Ethan. Sarah screamed my name, her voice raw with terror. I managed to knee my attacker in the gut, sending him stumbling back, off balance. I grabbed the knife, my hand slick with sweat and blood, and spun around, just in time to see the doppelganger poised over Jed, who lay pinned beneath it, unmoving. Jed's eyes were wide, staring up at the creature, terror fueling a frantic, futile struggle. The creature, my face contorted in a grotesque parody of my own features, placed a hand on Jed's throat, its touch possessive, almost savoring the kill. Something in me snapped, a primal rage, a desperate protectiveness for the man who had become our unlikely ally, surged through me, eclipsing even my own terror. I lunged, swinging the blade wildly, blindly, at the creature's back. As steel met flesh, it shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, releasing Jed with a guttural roar. But then, the doppelganger turned on me, its face twisted into a mask of pure, incandescent rage. With uncanny, impossible strength, it forced my arm to twist, the knife blade arsing back towards me. I felt my own body betraying me, my strength ebbing away, as if draining directly into it. Dizziness swam over me, the world tilting, my ears ringing. Through the corner of my vision, I saw Jed, bloodied and frantic, scrambling away, crawling backwards, desperate to escape. Then a monstrous, horrifying idea took hold, a chilling possibility that froze my blood in my veins. What if it was controlling me? Because suddenly, I was no longer certain whose hand was truly on the knife. It was as if a black haze descended over my mind, a cold, alien will overriding my own. My arm, raised. The blade came down. I heard a scream, raw and full of disbelief. Jed's voice. Then, there was a wet, sickening thud. Blood splattered across the damp grass, warm and thick. When my vision cleared, the doppelganger was gone, vanished. And I was on top of Jed. The hunting knife, Jed's knife, buried to the hilt in his chest. His eyes, wide and unseeing, locked onto mine, filled with a final, terrible confusion. And then the light in them faded, extinguished. I collapsed beside him, my own mind struggling to comprehend the unimaginable horror. Sarah ran to Jed, her face streaked with tears, frantically checking for a pulse. Nothing. She let out a choked sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief, her tears mingling with the blood staining her hands. For a fleeting, hallucinatory heartbeat, I thought I saw the doppelganger at the edge of the clearing, a malicious, triumphant smile twisting its features. Then, it was gone, swallowed by the trees. The robed figures, their faces pale, their ritual shattered, scattered, fleeing into the woods, clearly shaken by the carnage they had unleashed. Serafina, her face ashen but still disturbingly resolute, grabbed her leather-bound book and fled, disappearing into the trees after them. I tried to chase her, to scream, to demand answers, but my legs felt like lead, my body numb with shock. Sarah held me back, her grip surprisingly strong, her voice ragged with grief. Ethan, no. Jed's gone. We have to go. Half delirious with horror and guilt, We staggered out of Shadow Creek clearing, leaving Jed's body lying broken in the blood-soaked grass. I leaned heavily against Sarah, tears streaming down my face, my stomach churning with revulsion at what I had done, at what I had been forced to do. The doppelganger, it had twisted my own body into a murder weapon. I wasn't even sure, in that moment, if I wanted to survive, to live with the weight of that memory. But Sarah, trembling pale, but fiercely determined, kept me moving. She refused to let me succumb to despair, not in the heart of those cursed woods. After what felt like an eternity, we reached our car and collapsed inside, the false sanctuary of metal and glass offering little comfort. As I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them, I realized just how stained I was. Blood streaking my hands, my shirt, even my neck. The drive back to the cabin was a blur of silent, frantic motion, pulse racing, mind reeling, replaying the unimaginable events in the clearing over and over. Inside the cabin, we locked the door, secured every window, as if flimsy wood and glass could keep the nightmare out. Sarah helped me wash Jed's blood from my hands and arms, the cold water doing little to cleanse the stain on my soul. Both of us were trembling, beyond words. All I could do was mutter repeated apologies, though I wasn't even sure who they were for Jed, for Sarah, or for myself. She just held me, her eyes rimmed with tears, as I shook violently, the aftershocks of terror and guilt ripping through me. At some point, in a daze of shock, we called the local authorities, reporting an attack, a death. I was half prepared for them to dismiss as hysterical, to not believe our impossible story. But the sheer, raw terror in Sarah's voice, the undeniable stain of blood on my clothes, must have convinced them something terrible had happened. Within an hour, a lone deputy from the county sheriff's office arrived, his face paling visibly as he took in the sight of my torn clothes, Sarah's haunted eyes, the palpable atmosphere of dread clinging to the cabin. We tried to explain, in halting, broken words, about the group, the chanting, the creature, Jed's death in the clearing. The deputy, his initial skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence before him, signaled for backup. Soon, more officers arrived, their initial professionalism giving way to a guarded unease as they listened to our fragmented account. A few plainclothes individuals arrived later, introduced to us in hushed tones, FBI agents. They seemed oddly reserved, almost expectant, when we recounted the horrifying details, including the references to chanting, a cult-like group, and a creature that looked exactly like me. Instead of outright disbelief, I detected an undercurrent of quiet, chilling acceptance, as if they already knew more than they let on. The FBI agents, a man and a woman with unnervingly neutral expressions, questioned us separately. For hours, they took copious notes, their pens scratching across their pads, but rarely made eye contact. Their calm, clinical manner only amplified my anxiety, especially when they started steering the questions away from the creature itself and more towards who might be orchestrating paranormal illusions to commit crimes. I insisted, again and again, that I'd stabbed Jed under compulsion, that I'd been forced, controlled. But the agent's neutral expressions gave nothing away, offered no comfort, no reassurance. Days blurred into a nightmarish fog. The authorities visited Shadow Creek clearing, their search yielding nothing. They told us, their voices carefully neutral, that Jed's body was gone. No sign of Marcus, They corrected themselves, stumbling over the name. No sign of a ritual site, no trace of the robed figures. The ground was disturbed, they said, likely by animals, or the unpredictable mountain weather. When I insisted there had to be evidence of violence, they only mentioned finding possible footprints and some scattered personal items, but nothing conclusive, nothing that corroborated our horrific account. My stomach twisted into a knot of cold dread as I realized how quickly, how efficiently, the scene had been wiped clean or deliberately covered up. As the FBI's questioning continued, it became chillingly clear they were trying to wrap this case up quickly, quietly. Elena and I were told, in hushed, almost conspiratorial tones, that no formal charges would be filed against us, given the lack of substantial evidence. They advised us to return to Seattle, to seek professional help for the trauma. The unspoken message hung heavy in the air. None of this should leak to the public. Confused, grief-stricken, and utterly terrified, we complied. Before we left town, though we heard whispers, hushed rumors circulating among the locals, that a group of people, locals with ties to old traditions, had vanished around the same time as Jed's death. The local authorities offered no clarity, no explanation. The FBI refused to comment further. It was as if the entire incident, the horror we'd lived through, was being systematically erased from official memory. On our final day, as we numbly loaded the car, preparing to flee this cursed valley, I spotted a figure at the edge of the forest, half hidden in the shadows. Even from a distance, even partially obscured by the trees, I recognized the posture, slightly slumped, exactly like me. A wave of nausea, sharp and visceral, swept over me. I scrambled into the car, slamming the door shut, without looking back. The drive home was silent, a leaden weight of unspoken grief and terror filling the car. Sarah and I held hands, our fingers intertwined, a fragile lifeline in the face of unimaginable horror. I stared blankly at the endless ribbon of road unspooling before us, until my vision blurred, until my mind, exhausted, retreated into the relentless replay of Jed's death, of the doppelganger's sneering face, as it forced my hand, to commit that unspeakable act. We reached Seattle exhausted, hollowed out, each of us carrying a universe of guilt and grief inside. Weeks have passed since we returned, since we fled Blackwood Valley and the shadow that clung to us there. We've tried, desperately, to piece together a semblance of normal routine, to rebuild the shattered fragments of our lives. But the nightmares persist, vivid and relentless. I see Jed's eyes every time I close mine, wide with terror, fading into death. I wake in the night, drenched in sweat, certain I hear chanting outside the window, a faint, guttural echo carried on the wind. Sarah stands by me, bless her strength, as we both wrestle with the lingering horror, the insidious dread that has become our constant companion. We speak little of that day in Shadow Creek clearing, each of us trying, desperately, to bury the memory under a veneer of normalcy. Even though normalcy, I know with a chilling certainty, no longer exists for us. Sometimes, in fleeting moments of fragile stillness, I catch myself wondering, is it really me in my own skin? Or has the doppelganger somehow remained, possessed me, somehow, even after we escaped the valley? Sarah says I feel distant, changed, as if part of me is missing, lost somewhere in those cursed woods. Neither of us dares to even consider returning to Blackwood Valley. We've tried, repeatedly, to contact the sheriff's office for updates, for any kind of official explanation, but our calls are always redirected, lost in bureaucratic loops, or we're simply told the investigation is ongoing. The FBI never returned our calls. No matter what the official story is, no matter how they try to bury it, we know the truth. Something ancient, something malevolent, lurks in those woods. Something that took my shape, my face, and used it to commit murder. And there are people, dangerous, cunning people, who treat that entity as something to worship, or harness, or control. Jed's death is on my hands, literally and figuratively. But I cling, desperately, to the fragile hope that my guilt is at least partially overshadowed by the creature's malevolent control. Does that absolve me? I'm not sure it ever will. I write these words as both confession and warning. If you ever venture to the quiet corners of Blackwood Valley, to the shadowed depths of the Montana wilderness, remember my story. Remember, not everything that follows you out there is human, nor is every human you meet trustworthy. Some secrets the land itself refuses to share, and those who try to uncover them risk far more than they can possibly realize. I speak from bitter, devastating experience. I lost a friend, maybe more than a friend, and a part of myself, to the darkness that thrives in that remote wilderness. I wish I could offer a definitive conclusion, a neat resolution. The creature destroyed, the cult disbanded, the authorities unveiling the truth, justice served. But that's not how this ended. If it has ended at all. Sarah and I survive, day by day, existing in the hollow echo of our former lives, carrying the unbearable burden of what we witnessed, what we did. Sometimes, in the hush of dawn, in the oppressive silence of night, I imagine I hear a faint echo of chanting in the distance, carried on the wind, a memory, or a call. I can't tell anymore. All I know, with a chilling certainty that settles deep in my bones, is that darkness isn't banished by distance. It clings to you, especially when it shares your face. And that's my final warning to anyone who hears this story. The doppelganger is out there, waiting, wearing a familiar face, ready to tear your life apart the moment you let your guard down. I've learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, how terrifyingly thin the line is between who we are and what we fear. If you ever see a version of yourself standing in the shadows, run. Because once it has your name, your voice, your shape, there may be no escape from the nightmare it brings. My name is Alex, and at 32, I was desperately seeking a clean slate. October of 2023 was a blur of shadows I couldn't shake. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, the chilling reality clung to me, each horrific moment replaying in vivid detail. I'd traded the relentless rain of Seattle for the quiet unease of Oak Haven, a small town nestled on the fringes of Blackwood National Forest. It was supposed to be a reset button after a year that had chewed me up and spat me out. Nature had always been my sanctuary, and Blackwood, with its ancient, brooding forests, had been calling to me for months. Whispers of forgotten trails, tales of witchcraft, and Native American legends clung to certain corners of that wilderness, giving it a reputation that prickled my skin with a mix of fear and fascination. It was the kind of raw, untamed place that promised both an adrenaline surge and a spiritual detox, exactly what my fractured soul craved. Sarah, my friend since college, was 29 and grounded in the practical, didn't share my morbid curiosity for the supernatural. But she had her own ghosts to outrun, a messy family situation, a soul-crushing job, and the fresh sting of a breakup. When I pitched her my plan to camp in one of Blackwood's less trodden sectors, she agreed with a sigh that sounded more like resignation. "If you get dragged off into the woods by some monster, I'm haunting you," she joked, but her eyes held a flicker of genuine worry. And then there was Elias. He was our wild card, the third shadow in our little expedition. Early 40s. Rugged in a way that felt performative, and boasting an expertise in navigating the deepest parts of Blackwood. I'd found him on some obscure online forum, a haunt for thrill, seekers swapping stories and offering guided experiences for a price that seemed too good to be true. From our first phone call, he'd exuded this unsettling mix of knowledge and eagerness. In hindsight, the red flags were practically waving. But when you're desperate for an escape, you tend to ignore the warnings. Elias spun tales of growing up practically in Blackwood's backyard, claiming an almost mystical connection to its hidden trails and untamed beauty. He hinted at places not marked on any map, whispering about corners of the forest accessible only to those who were chosen or ready. Sarah, predictably, rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. But I, in my naive yearning for something beyond the mundane, took Elias's words as local color, the charming bravado of a backwoods storyteller. How utterly wrong I was. We met Elias on a Friday afternoon that felt like the prelude to a storm, at the edge of a rutted dirt road bordering Blackwood National Forest. His Jeep, a battered forest green beast, was piled high with camping gear that looked like it had seen better centuries. The plan was for him to drive us deep into the woods, hours down trails that demanded four-wheel drive and a healthy disregard for vehicle suspension. From there, we'd hike another mile or so to a clearing he described as having celestial views and an abandoned logging cabin, a relic from a bygone era. "Perfect spot for your little adventure," he'd said, winking at me in a way that initially felt like playful camaraderie, but now just sends a shiver of revulsion down my spine. Sarah and I crammed into the Jeep's back seat, swallowed by the scent of canvas, motor oil, and something vaguely animal. She leaned close, her breath warm against my ear. "This feels off, Alex. Really off." But we were already committed. The engine was rumbling to life, and a reckless excitement was bubbling in my chest. We made strained small talk with Elias about the local wildlife. He rattled off names: black bear, mountain lion, elk, like he was reading from a park brochure. I, of course, had to nudge him towards the darker side. "Any stories about, witches, cryptids, strange things out here?" Elias grinned, a flash of teeth in his weathered face. "Oh, there are stories, all right. Folks around here whisper about a woman, they call her Serafina, a witch who's been part of these woods longer than any living memory." Sarah groaned dramatically, but Elias pressed on, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "They say she was a settler's daughter, fell in with a Native American guide, learned the old ways, the secrets of the forest. Some say she commanded spirits, others that she was cursed. Vanished one day. No, they say her spirit, or something far worse, still lingers, leading travelers astray." He delivered this campfire tale with practiced ease, and a shiver did crawl down my spine, despite myself. But the landscape outside the Jeep windows was a more immediate distraction. Towering pines, ancient firs, a canopy so dense it choked out the already fading sunlight. Deeper and deeper we drove, the road shrinking until it was barely two tire tracks gouged into the earth. The undergrowth clawing at the Jeep's sides like skeletal fingers. By the time Elias finally parked, the sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and bruised purple. He helped us unload, his movements too quick, too eager. As we set off on foot, the air turned knife sharp, and the forest seemed to hush, holding its breath. Pines loomed like silent sentinels, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and a cloying sweetness I couldn't quite place. My boots crunched on the fallen leaves, and Sarah kept glancing at her phone, the screen stubbornly blank. "No signal," she muttered, her voice tight. "Don't need it," Elias said, pulling out a worn, folded paper map that looked older than he was. "I know where we're going. See that ridge lane? That's Olympus Edgy, as they call it. Cabin's just beyond, near the clearing." He pointed with a dirt-stained finger, his confidence radiating off him like heat. Despite Sarah's persistent skepticism, I found myself strangely calmed by his assuredness. Maybe 30 minutes of hiking, the trail winding uphill, and we reached it. Olympus Edge. The name was grandiose for what was essentially a rocky outcrop overlooking a vast, darkening valley. Far below, I could just make out the faint silver ribbon of a river snaking through the trees. Then I saw the cabin, half swallowed by the encroaching forest, roof slumped like a defeated man's shoulders, windows gaping like empty eye sockets. It was decaying, forgotten, but possessed a melancholic beauty, a stark reminder of humanity's fleeting presence in the face of nature's indifferent grandeur. And, I'll admit, a thrill, a dark, illicit excitement flickered within me at the thought of ghosts, hidden relics, stories waiting to be unearthed. We pitched our tents a short distance from the dilapidated structure, close enough for shelter if the weather turned, far enough to avoid being crushed if the whole thing decided to give up the ghost. By dusk, we had a meager fire crackling to life. Sarah and I perched on fallen logs, fingers thawing in the hesitant warmth, while Elias, ever the eager host, stoked the flames and laid out a meager offering of jerky and trail mix. Then it started. The subtle shift, the first hairline crack in the veneer of normalcy. It began with the wind, a sudden, violent gust that whipped through the clearing, carrying with it a scent that made my stomach clench. Burnt herbs, something acrid and bitter, catching in the back of my throat. Sarah stiffened beside me, head snapping up as if someone had brushed past, trailing a cloud of pungent incense. Then, as quickly as it came, the wind died, leaving not a trace, not even a rustle in the leaves. I tried to rationalize it, to chalk it up to the strangeness of the wilderness, but a cold knot of unease tightened in my gut. Elias, for a long moment, said nothing. Then, with a low, unsettling chuckle, he remarked, "Sometimes folks around here burn sweetgrass, sage's ceremonies, you know. Maybe just a stray breeze from across the ridge." But his eyes didn't meet mine, and I sensed a carefully constructed lie in his casual explanation, a deliberate withholding. After our silent, tension-filled dinner, we retreated to our tents. I was jumpy, every rustle of leaves sounding like approaching footsteps, but I told myself it was just nerves. the heightened senses of being so utterly alone in the wilderness. The night descended, a suffocating blanket of silence. No crickets chirped, no nocturnal animals rustled in the undergrowth. Nothing. Around midnight, a prickling unease pulled me awake. I unzipped the tent flap and peered out. The moon, a stark white disk in the inky sky, cast a ghostly light over the clearing. And that's when I saw it. Etched into the bark of a tree closest to the cabin, a symbol I hadn't noticed before. A spiral, intricate and unsettling, with lines slashing through it like angry scars. It looked fresh. The cuts in the bark were raw, bleeding sap. My stomach twisted. I told myself I'd show Sarah in the morning, that together we'd figure out what it meant, what was happening in this silent, watchful forest. But even as I told myself that, a deeper, colder fear began to take root. I woke to a dull, oppressive grey light filtering through the tent fabric, and the pervasive smell of something burning, acrid and unsettling, stronger now than the night before. Bolting upright, I scrambled out of the tent. Elias was crouched by a pathetic little fire, coaxing flames from damp twigs, humming a tuneless, discordant melody that grated on my already frayed nerves. Sarah was already up, rummaging through her pack, her movements stiff and preoccupied. I didn't waste a second. "Sarah, look at this." I pointed to the tree nearest the cabin, the one bathed in moonlight hours earlier, now starkly revealed in the morning's weak light. The spiral symbol was even more disturbing in daylight, the raw cuts in the bark stark against the rough wood. Elias glanced over, his eyes flicking to the carving and back to the fire, a dismissive shrug in his shoulders. Local kids, probably. But even his voice lacked conviction. He didn't meet my gaze. Sarah frowned, stepping closer to the tree, tracing the spiral with a hesitant finger. "Kids, out here. That's a bit of a stretch, even for you, Elias, who hikes all the way out to Olympus' edge, just to carve creepy symbols into trees." We let it drop, the uneasy question hanging heavy in the morning air. A palpable tension had sprung up between us, a silent acknowledgement that something was deeply, unsettlingly out of sync. An unspoken dread began to coil in my stomach. We spent the better part of the morning in a restless, aimless exploration of the immediate area. The cabin, in the cold light of day, was even more desolate. Inside, it was just a shell, a moldering wooden table slumped against one wall, rusted steel hooks clinging to others, ghosts of a life long gone. In the far corner, almost hidden in the shadows, I found more markings. A circle this time, with lines radiating outwards, each line ending in a small, deliberate X. They looked old, etched with a care that felt almost ritualistic. When we regrouped outside, the silence of the forest pressing in on us, Elias suggested a day hike. Hidden waterfalls, he'd announced, too brightly, deeper in the woods. Place practically no one knows about. Sarah, her face pale and drawn, mumbled something about not feeling well, about wanting to stay at camp. But Elias was strangely insistent. He pushed, his eyes fixed on me. "Come on, Alex. You're the adventure, right? Don't want to miss out." There was something in his tone, a subtle pressure, that made me instinctively recoil. For the first time, a sharp, cold spike of unease went through me regarding Elias himself. But I pushed it down, telling myself I was being paranoid, letting the atmosphere get to me. So we packed water, some trail bars, and set off, deeper into the woods. The day hike quickly devolved into a forced march into an increasingly oppressive forest. The canopy thickened, swallowing the already weak sunlight until the sky was just a distant, fractured tapestry of leaves and branches. At times, I glanced back, half expecting Sarah to have vanished, swallowed by the shadows. She was there, trudging along, silent, her face a mask of grim determination. Elias, too, had fallen into a strange quiet. He walked ahead, his usual forced cheerfulness gone, replaced by a watchful stillness. He kept glancing around, his head cocked, as if listening for something just beyond the reach of human hearing. After what felt like hours, we reached a small, moss-choked stream. Elias stopped abruptly on the opposite bank. "Let's rest here," he said, his voice flat. "Need to check something." He pulled a battered, leather-bound notebook from his pack. It looked ancient, the pages yellowed and brittle. He flipped through it, his brow furrowed, pages filled with scribbled notes, indecipherable symbols that echoed the carvings we'd seen. He kept returning to one page in particular, his gaze flicking from the notebook to the trees around us, a strange intensity in his eyes. "Elias," I asked, trying to keep my voice even, "what exactly are you looking for?" He gave me that tight, unsettling smile. "Nothing, Alex. Just making sure we're on the right path." Sarah, her patience finally snapping, rounded on him. "Right path? What right path? You never said anything about following some coded symbols in the middle of nowhere. You said waterfalls, alias. Waterfalls." He snapped the notebook shut, stuffing it back into his pack with a jerky movement. "Relax, Sarah. We'll get to the waterfalls. Just sometimes I consult these old notes. Belonged to my grandfather. He used to track unusual sightings in these woods." Grandfather. This was the first I'd heard of any grandfather, any family history beyond his vague claims of growing up near Blackwood. I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but the closed, almost hostile look on his face warned me to back off. We resumed hiking, the silence stretching, thick and suffocating. 10 minutes later, Elias stopped dead. I followed his gaze. Carved deep into the trunk of a massive cedar, its bark gnarled and ancient, was the same spiral I'd seen near the cabin. And beneath it, freshly etched into the wood, a single word. Seraphina. A wave of icy dread washed over me, so intense it almost buckled my knees. I felt the blood drain from my face. Elias's face hardened, all pretense of charm gone. "We need to go back," he said, his voice clipped urgent. He turned and, without waiting for a response, started back towards camp, moving with a brisk, almost panicked pace. Sarah and I exchanged a look of pure, unfiltered worry. But we followed. His sudden urgency, his stark shift in demeanor, was more alarming than any carved symbol. Something had shifted, something had broken. And I had a terrifying feeling we were about to find out exactly what. We scrambled back towards camp, the forest floor a blur beneath my boots. Elias set a relentless pace, his earlier bravado replaced by a grim, driven energy. Sarah and I struggled to keep up, the silence between us thick with unspoken fear. His sudden panic was contagious, a cold dread seeping into my bones, more potent than any campfire ghost story. We reached the clearing in record time, lungs burning, hearts hammering against our ribs. What we found there stopped us dead in our tracks. Our campsite, it wasn't just disturbed, it was violated. Our tents, once neatly pitched, were now slashed open, ripped fabric flapping in the breeze like wounded wings. The gashes looked vicious, deliberate, as if torn by something sharp, something clawed. Clothes, sleeping bags, supplies, everything was strewn across the clearing, tossed and scattered like unwanted debris. The pungent, burnt odor from the wind was back, clinging to the air, heavier now, suffocating. My breath hitched. My heart slammed against my ribs as I noticed another carving, this one on a different tree, closer to where my tent had stood. Crude, brutal, a grotesque depiction of a woman's face, all sharp angles and hollow, accusing eyes. And beneath it, the name again, Serafina. Sarah let out a shaky exhale, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. What the hell is going on? Elias. Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. Elias licked his lips, his eyes darting around the clearing, never settling, never meeting ours. I don't know. But the lie was etched in the tight lines around his mouth, in the frantic flicker of his gaze. He knew. He knew exactly what was happening, and he'd led us straight into it. We spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze of frantic, futile salvage. My clothes were scattered in the dirt. Some of our food supplies were missing, and circling the ravaged campsite, I saw them footprints. Bare footprints, disturbingly human in shape, but too long, too narrow, pressed deep into the earth as if bearing an unnatural weight. A bitter, icy dread sank into my stomach. We weren't just being watched, we were being stalked. The sun began to sink, painting the sky in ominous shades of bruised purple and blood orange, mirroring the unease that churned within me. We made a collective, desperate decision: the cabin. Risky as it was, with its crumbling walls and air of decay, it was shelter. Our tents were useless, shredded beyond repair. Sarah and I dragged the torn tent fabric inside the cabin, a pathetic attempt to block the gaping windows, stuffing the holes with planks of rotting wood pried from the floor. We lit the lanterns, their weak glow pushing back the encroaching shadows. And Elias, with a grim efficiency, built a fire in the old stone fireplace, the flames casting dancing, distorted shapes on the cabin walls. Then I saw it. Leaning against the doorframe, almost hidden in shadow, Elias held a rifle. A hunting rifle, solid and menacing. Something he hadn't mentioned, hadn't shown us until this moment. Nightfall descended, the wind picking up again, swirling fallen leaves and dust around the clearing, carrying that same cloying, acrid scent of burnt herbs. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in, pressing down. It was then, huddled around the fire, the shadows deepening in the corners of the cabin, that Elias finally broke. He admitted what he knew, the stories he'd been hinting at, the darkness he'd knowingly led us into. "Thea's a legend," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "My grandfather told me about Serafina. She was a woman, once. Dabbled in the old magic, tried to control the spirits of these woods. Took it too far, got lost in the power, became something else." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "A witch. They say she could command the elements, weave illusions, even control people." He looked up, his eyes haunted, flickering in the firelight. "My family, they had a hand in banishing her, generations ago." His knuckles were white around the rifle stock. "I've been studying the symbols, the runes, trying to track signs that she's back, or that she never truly left." The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, the firelight to dim. It was like a physical blow. The realization that we weren't just lost, we weren't just camping in a creepy forest. We were pawns in some twisted, generations-old game. And you brought us out here, why? I snapped, the fear finally curdling into anger. So we're basically bait for your witch hunt. He avoided my eyes, shame, or perhaps something darker, flickering across his face. Sarah looked furious, her hands clenched into fists, as if she was physically restraining herself from attacking him. But before either of us could unleash our rage, something slammed against the cabin door from outside. A brutal, echoing kick that rattled the flimsy hinges, the wooden frame groaning in protest. My heart leaped into my throat, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. A voice female, but warped, unnatural, raspy as dry leaves skittering across stone, hissed from the other side of the door. Come on out, little birds. No sense hiding. We froze, paralyzed. Elia's mouth. Stay quiet, his eyes wide with terror. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the door began to creak open. Elias raised the rifle, his hands shaking so violently, I thought he might drop it. But the figure that burst through the doorway moved too fast, a blur of motion, a whirlwind of darkness. All I registered was a swirl of dark cloth, hair matted with leaves and dirt, obscuring her face, and eyes that burned with a malevolent, unnatural green light. She moved with impossible speed, impossibly strength, in a single fluid motion. She knocked the rifle from Elias's grasp. The shot exploded, deafening in the confined space, the sound ripping through the cabin, splintering a beam in the ceiling. I screamed. Sarah lunged for the fallen rifle, but the figure, Serafina, shoved her back with brutal force. Time seemed to warp, to stretch and slow. Elias scrambled backwards, tripping over a log, falling away. Sarah lay on the floor, coughing, choking in the sudden cloud of gun smoke, and I finally got a clearer look at the intruder. Sallow skin, stretched taut over sharp bones, ragged nails, like claws, a face half hidden by a tangle of dark, greasy hair. She looked both young and ancient, impossibly so, and her eyes, those eyes, burned with that haunting, sickly green light. Serafina, she rasped, her voice a chorus of dry leaves and cracking twigs. Then, a sound that chilled me to the core, laughter. A laughter that didn't belong to any human throat. A sound like 1,000 crows taking flight. A sound that promised pain and madness. With a flick of her wrist, a gesture so casual it was terrifying, Serafina conjured a gust of wind, a sudden, violent vortex that ripped through the cabin, extinguishing the lanterns, plunging us into near, total darkness. Only the dying embers in the fireplace cast a faint, flickering glow, enough to silhouette her form as she darted forward, a predator striking. She grabbed Sarah's arm. Sarah screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure agony. I lunged, adrenaline surging, blind panic overriding reason. My hands scrabbled for anything to use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a broken plank of wood, a rusted nail protruding from its end. But before I could even swing, something struck me. On the head, hard. A blinding flash of white light exploded behind my eyes. And then, darkness. I crumpled to the floor. The last thing I saw, through the fading haze of unconsciousness, was Sarah being dragged, limp and screaming, out of the cabin and into the night. Her terror-filled cries echoing in my ears as the darkness swallowed me whole. Okay, here is part 4, the concluding part of your story. I focused on bringing the narrative to a climax and resolution, while maintaining the dark and suspenseful tone. Part 4. Ashes and echoes. I surfaced from the blackness with a splitting headache, a throbbing pulse behind my eyes that mirrored the frantic beat of my heart. A weak, grey dawn seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls, painting stripes of pale light across the dusty floor. My throat was raw, my mouth felt like sandpaper. Gideon was kneeling beside me, his face etched with exhaustion and fear, shaking my shoulder urgently. Alex, Alex, wake up. My vision swam, the cabin spinning around me. It took a moment, a disoriented, terrifying moment, to realize that Sarah wasn't there. The space beside me was empty, cold. Sarah? I croaked, my voice a broken rasp. Where is she? Gideon's expression was haunted, his eyes dark pools of despair. She's gone, Alex. That thing took her, right away. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the agonizing throb in my skull, the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. We have to find her, now. He nodded, a grim, solemn movement. I know. But we need a plan. Serafina, she's not just some backwoods maniac. There's real power in her. A rage and desperation surged, overriding the fear that had been paralyzing me. I grabbed his shirt, my fingers digging into the rough fabric. Rachel could be dying. Or worse. We don't have time for your cryptic nonsense, Gideon. He exhaled sharply, then motioned for me to follow, his movements stiff, wary. We stumbled out of the cabin into the weak morning light. The clearing was stark, empty, but the ground told a horrifying story. Footprints, yes, but also a clear drag mark, leading east, towards the denser, darker woods. The trail looked like something heavy. Something lifeless had been hauled through the mud and leaf litter. My stomach churned. She'll take Sarah to a place of ritual, Gideon murmured, his voice distant, almost to himself. Likely deeper in the forest. Where those old runes, those symbols, they come from. I didn't stop to think, didn't question. I just started following the drag marks, my legs moving on autopilot, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate, glowing hope. Gideon grabbed his rifle, miraculously intact except for a few dents and scratches, and trotted after me, his breath ragged. We moved quickly, hearts pounding in unison, the gruesome trail leading us deeper into the woods. Trees loomed, their bark scarred with the same twisted symbols, spirals and crosses and shapes that defied any logic, any human understanding. At one point, we passed a deer carcass, mangled and torn apart, its eyes wide, frozen in a silent scream of terror, even in death. I forced my mind away from the image, from the implications. We had to keep moving. Hours blurred into a relentless, agonizing trek through the oppressive forest. Then, finally, the trees began to thin. The canopy opened, and we stumbled into a clearing. But this wasn't the clearing with the cabin. This was different. Unnatural. I didn't recognize it from any map I'd ever seen. Tall wooden stakes, crudely sharpened, were driven into the ground, forming a rough, uneven circle. And tied to one of them, slumped and motionless, was Sarah. Her arms stretched above her head, her shirt stained dark with blood. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the clearing. She was alive, conscious, but barely. Her head lolled to the side, her breathing shallow. I scanned the clearing, my eyes desperately searching for movement. Initially, I saw no one else. Just Sarah, bound to the stake, and the unsettling circle of sharpened wood. Gideon and I crept forward, moving like shadows. staying low in the undergrowth, using the sparse bushes as cover. My eyes swept across the clearing, taking in the horrifying details. Skulls. Small animal skulls, bleached white, littered the ground within the circle, arranged in macabre patterns. And in the center, a large, flat stone slab stained dark, almost black, with more of those runic symbols painted around its perimeter in what looked chillingly like dried blood. A wave of nausea washed over me, bile rising in my throat. Then I saw her, Seraphina. She stood on the far side of the clearing, near the stone slab, her back to us, chanting in a language that scraped against my sanity, a guttural, inhuman tongue that seemed to vibrate in the very air around us. I could barely process the horror of it. Sarah helpless, in mortal danger. And we were outnumbered. Because then I saw them. 3 more figures, human shapes, but wrong. Clad in filthy, ragged clothes, half hidden behind the stakes, their faces blank, vacant. As if enthralled, puppets dancing to Seraphina's horrific tune. Gideon's whisper was barely audible, his breath hot against my ear. We need to separate them from Seraphina, somehow. If I can get a shot. But won't she just conjure more wind, illusions? My voice trembled, barely a thread of sound. He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on Seraphina. Possible. But maybe I can distract her. Long enough for you to free Sarah. He squeezed my arm, his grip surprisingly firm. My entire body was shaking, cold sweat slicking my palms. Let's do it, I whispered back, the words catching in my throat. We split up, moving like ghosts in the undergrowth. Gideon took a wide arc around the clearing, positioning himself behind a dense stand of trees. I waited, crouched behind a rotting log, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, watching, waiting for his signal. When I saw his silhouette shift in the distance, a subtle movement in the shadows, I locked eyes with him, a silent, desperate communication passing between us. He nodded, a barely perceptible jerk of his head. Then, the forest exploded. The rifle shot ripped through the morning stillness, the echo thunderous, shattering the oppressive silence. A chunk of bark exploded from a tree near Seraphina, showering her with splinters. She spun around, instantly alert, her eyes flaring with incandescent green rage. Her acolytes, startled, jerked into motion, turning towards Gideon's position. This was my chance. I didn't hesitate. I bolted, racing across the clearing, the stench of blood and decay hitting me full force. A physical assault on my senses. I forced myself to ignore it, to focus only on Sarah. She was barely conscious, her head lolling, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. Relief warred with terror in her eyes as she saw me. I reached the stake, my hands fumbling, clumsy at the thick ropes binding her wrists. They were knotted tight, impossibly so. "Hang on," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm getting you out." She moaned, a low, guttural sound of pain. I frantically scanned the ground, my fingers scrabbling through the dirt and bone fragments. My hand closed around something sharp, jagged, a broken shard of stone. Desperate, I started sawing at the rope, the rough stone tearing at my skin, the fibers stubbornly resisting. Another shot echoed from the trees. Gideon keeping Seraphine occupied, buying us precious seconds. But for how long? Finally, with a sickening snap, the rope gave way. Sarah slumped forward, collapsing into my arms. She was bleeding, shallow cuts crisscrossing her arms, bruises blooming like dark flowers on her shoulders. Her eyelids fluttered open, just enough to recognize me. Relief, fragile and fleeting, flickered in her eyes, then was swallowed by a fresh wave of terror. "Alex," she whispered, her voice thin, reedy. She did something to me. I can feel her inside my head." Panic surged, threatening to drown me. But I fought it back, forcing myself to focus on the immediate, the tangible. "Stay with me," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Stay with me, Sarah. We're getting you out of here. First, we need to get away from this place." I half lifted, half dragged her away from the circle, stumbling through the tall, overgrown grass, the sharp blades scratching at our ankles. I glanced back over my shoulder, just in time to see Serafina raise her hands, her arms outstretched towards Gideon. And then, the air itself seemed to warp. A swirling vortex of leaves and debris erupted around him, a miniature whirlwind conjured from nothing. He fired again, the gunshot swallowed by the rising wind, the bullet seeming to ricochet off something unseen, an invisible barrier shimmering around Serafina. One of Serafina's acolytes, a gaunt figure with eyes like burnt holes, hurled himself at Gideon with a guttural roar. Gideon, impossibly quick, managed to dodge the attack, swinging the rifle butt in a brutal arc, smashing it into the man's face. The acolyte crumpled, falling to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. I wanted to help Gideon, to turn back to fight. But Sarah was limp, barely conscious, in no state to walk, let alone run. I half carried, half dragged her deeper into the woods, away from the clearing, away from Serafina. The chanting behind us intensified, Serafina's voice rising in power, laced with triumph. Suddenly, Sarah shrieked, a high-pitched, agonizing cry that tore through the forest. She clutched her head, her body convulsing, her eyes rolling back in her skull. "Sarah," I cried, fear lancing through me like ice, but she yanked her arm away from me with surprising, unnatural strength. "She's in my head." Sarah's voice rasped, but it was layered, distorted, echoing with something else. Something cold and alien that made my skin crawl. Her fingers curled, twisting into claws. For a terrifying moment, I thought she would attack me. Then, her eyes, her own eyes, flickered back into focus, filled with a desperate, pleading terror. "Run," she gasped, her voice strained. "Please, Alex, just run. She's controlling me." I hesitated, my heart torn, ripped in two. From the distance, carried on the wind, we both heard it. Gideon's scream. I grit my teeth, a cold resolve hardening within me. "Stay close, Sarah," I said, my voice low, fierce. "We need to keep moving." We plunged deeper into the forest, forging ahead, the adrenaline a burning tide in my veins. I wasn't sure where I was going, if I was even going in the right direction. Trees pressed in from all sides, ancient and gnarled, some so thick with moss their trunks appeared soft, indistinct, like phantoms. Every now and then, I heard something behind us, footsteps, or just the snap of twigs. Paranoia gnawed at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, of Serafina's silhouette gliding through the trees, always just out of sight. Then, we stumbled onto it, a partial dirt road, barely more than a narrow, overgrown path. I recognized it, or thought I did. One of the trails we'd traveled earlier with Elias. But my head was swimming with fear, exhaustion blurring my senses. I couldn't be sure. And then, Sarah stumbled again, her legs giving out, collapsing onto her knees. I knelt beside her, trying to lift her, to urge her onward. She coughed, her eyes unfocused, delirious. I can't keep going, Alex. My head, it's... She pressed her palms to her temples, her face contorted in agony, like knives. For a moment, a horrifying, shameful thought flickered through my mind. Leave her. Find help. But the thought was instantly, violently rejected. I couldn't abandon her. Not here. Especially not like this. Then, a rustling in the underbrush, close, too close, made my blood run cold. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline spiking again, brandishing a thick branch I'd picked up as a makeshift weapon. Prepared to fight, to defend. But it wasn't Serafina. It was Gideon. He emerged from the trees, his face streaked with blood, a dark gash running down one side, his rifle slung warily over his shoulder. His eyes flicked between me and Sarah, his breath ragged. "We need to get out of here," he gasped, his voice strained.
No.
Sarah looked up, a flicker of relief, quickly replaced by pain, crossing her face. "She's still in my head," she whimpered. Gideon sighed, a ragged, defeated sound. "Serafina, she tried to kill me. But I managed to slip away. Thosey things, they obey her every command. I think she wants us all alive. For something worse." He bent down, lifting Sarah, one arm under her shoulders, supporting her weight. Together, we stumbled along the path, the minutes stretching into an eternity. The forest seemed endless, a maze of shadows and whispers. Eventually, we reached it. A dilapidated shack, even older, even more decrepit than the cabin, perched precariously at the edge of a steep ravine. Gideon kicked open the rotting wooden door. The interior was dank, air thick with the smell of mold and decay, but it offered four walls, a roof, a temporary respite from the relentless elements. We laid Sarah down on what looked like a wooden bench, its surface coated in dust and grime. I propped her head on my pack, trying to make her as comfortable as possible. Gideon tore a strip of cloth from his already bloodied shirt and pressed it to a cut on her forehead. "I don't know how to fix this, Alex," he admitted, his voice trembling, raw with exhaustion and despair. "If Serafina is inside her mind, we need more than just bandages." I clenched my hands into fists, desperation clawing at me. "Tell me how to stop her, Gideon. You said you've been studying your grandfather's notes. There has to be a clue. How did he banish her before?" Gideon pulled out the battered notebook, its leather cover stained, the edges smeared with his own blood. He flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning the faded ink, the cryptic symbols and sketches. His finger stopped, hovering over a passage that looked different, more recent than the rest, the ink darker, the script sharper. I leaned in, peering over his shoulder. I couldn't understand the language. A bizarre mixture of Latin and something else, something ancient and unknown. He translated in hushed tones, his voice barely above a whisper. She draws power from the forest, from sacrifices, human ones, particularly." He swallowed hard, his face pale in the dim light. "My grandfather wrote that you could weaken her by severing her connection to the place she's anchored, a specific site, possibly the old cabin, or of an ancient circle of stones." He looked up at me, his eyes desperate, pleading for a solution. "Once that bond is broken, she loses most of her abilities. Then she can be killed, or at least wounded enough to force her spirit away." Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered within me. "So we destroy that place?" I asked, my voice trembling, barely daring to believe it. He nodded, his face grim. It may be the circle near where you found Sarah. Or maybe another. We need to find out exactly which site anchors her. A low groan from Sarah broke our desperate planning. She mumbled incoherently, her body twitching, convulsing, as if caught in the grip of some invisible seizure. We had to act. Soon. I stepped outside the shack, gasping for a breath of fresh air, trying to clear my head, to think. The day was fading, the sun hidden behind a thick, oppressive blanket of clouds, and then I saw it. Something that made my heart stop, then lurch into a frantic gallop. Two men. Plain black suits, incongruous in the wilderness, walking through the trees, scanning the area with a grim, methodical efficiency. I ducked back inside the shack, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Gideon," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "There are two guys out there. Black suits. Look like government types." He frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Are you sure?" I peeked out again, peering through a crack in the rotting wood. They were definitely not park rangers. Black jackets, dark sunglasses, even in the fading light. And one of them, he was holding something. A device, scanning the ground, its screen glowing with an eerie light. "FBI," breathed, my voice barely a whisper. "I think they look like FBI." My pulse raced. Could it be? Had someone somehow called for help? Was rescue finally here? But as I watched them, their movements, their intense, focused search, they didn't look like they were searching for us. They looked like they were searching for evidence. Or perhaps trying to track something. Suddenly, one of the men stopped, his head snapping up, his gaze locking onto the shack. He'd seen me. Panic flared, hot and sharp. I stepped out into the open, into full view, my hands raised in a gesture of desperate surrender. "Help," I cried, my voice cracking with relief and terror. "Please. We have an injured friend." The man made a subtle gesture to his partner, a barely perceptible nod of his head. They approached cautiously, their expressions eerily calm, almost detached. "Ma'am," said the taller one, his voice flat, professional. "We're with the FBI's local field office. We've received reports of missing persons around these parts." He glanced at Gideon, who had stepped out of the shack, his rifle held loosely in his hand. "You folks all right?" Relief washed over me, so intense it almost buckled my knees. Perhaps we were safe after all. Maybe the authorities would finally step in, take control, arrest Serafina, or at least handle this impossible situation. We led them inside the shack, the air thick with the smell of mold and fear, to where Sarah lay moaning softly on the bench. They crouched beside her, their professional masks momentarily slipping, replaced by a flicker of something, not quite concern, but interest. They offered to radio for medical assistance, their voices calm, reassuring. But then, something shifted, the tone changed, when Gideon, his voice still shaking, started to explain. To stammer out the unbelievable story of Serafina, of the witch in the woods. Their demeanor hardened. The calm professionalism vanished, replaced by something colder, more calculating. One of them, the taller one, began pressing Gideon, his questions sharp, aggressive. "Exactly which region did you say you came from? And how long have you been studying these so-called legends?" He seemed less concerned with Sarah's clearly deteriorating condition than with the precise location of ritual sites. Gideon, perhaps foolishly, perhaps desperately hoping for help, provided details. The old cabin, Olympus Edge, the clearing with the stakes. As he spoke, the agents exchanged a look, a quick, meaningful glance that sent a fresh wave of unease washing over me. Their eyes narrowed. They stepped aside, murmuring to each other in low, urgent tones. Then, they turned back to us, their faces carefully blank again. "We'll escort you out to the main road," the taller agent said, his voice clipped, devoid of any warmth. "But first we'll check out that clearing. We have reason to believe there are criminals involved." Criminals. Something in my gut twisted, a cold, visceral rejection of their words. I didn't trust them. Not fully. They were too distant, too methodical, too incurious about the horrifying details. They asked no questions about the supernatural force that had attacked us, about Sarah's possession, about the impossible events of the past 2 days. Still, they were authority. They were our only hope. And they were offering a way out. They helped us lift Sarah to her feet, their touch strangely impersonal, almost clinical. We started hiking back, following the agents, retracing the path Gideon and I had taken earlier. After maybe half an hour of strained, silent walking, we reached the clearing with the stakes. The clearing where Sarah had been bound, where Seraphina had chanted her terrifying incantations. But it was empty, utterly, completely empty. No stakes, no bloodstains on the ground, no scattered animal skulls, no sign, no trace of the macabre scene from earlier. My mouth dropped open, a silent scream trapped in my throat. Everything was gone. As if it had never happened. Sarah whimpered beside me, swaying on her feet, her eyes wide, unfocused. "I can't believe it." She stared at the empty circle of ground, her ordeal still itched across her face, in bruises and cuts. Undeniable proof that something had happened. Yet the evidence, it had vanished. Finished. The shorter agent exhaled, pulling out a camera, a sleek, professional model, and snapping pictures. Pictures of nothing but empty ground. Gideon and I exchanged a look of pure, bewildered horror. "Must have moved on," the taller agent said, his voice neutral, dismissive. "We'll file a report." He motioned for us to follow, turning and heading back into the forest, deeper, not out. I hovered protectively near Sarah, my arm around her waist, supporting her weight. But Gideon hung back, a growing unease radiating from him. After a moment, he tugged at my sleeve, pulling me back, slowing my pace, letting the agents get further ahead. "Alex," he whispered, his voice urgent, frantic. "I don't trust them." I nodded, my heart pounding in agreement. Neither. We needed to get Sarah to real medical help, and we couldn't do that alone. But these men, they weren't help. They were something else. Something colder. Suddenly, a commotion erupted up ahead. The agents' voices, sharp, tense, cutting through the silence. "Stop right there. Hands where we can see them." Then I saw who they were shouting at. Seraphina. Or rather, a silhouette of her, a flicker of darkness at the edge of the trees. She appeared, then vanished, like a flickering flame in the wind. The agents barreled ahead, crashing through the undergrowth, in pursuit. Gideon and I exchanged another look, this one a silent pact. Before carefully, cautiously, continuing forward, Sarah leaning heavily on my arm. What we found just beyond the bend in the trail made my blood run colder than ice. The agents. They lay crumpled on the forest floor, their black suits torn, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles. Their eyes were wide open, staring up at the indifferent canopy, frozen in a mask of absolute, uncomprehending shock. One was motionless, still. The other he was crawling backwards, away from the trees, babbling incoherently. "Illusions," he gasped. "Can't be possible." Serafina was nowhere in sight. The unconscious agent's phone, a satellite model, lay cracked and useless on the ground. I knelt beside the crawling agent, his eyes locking onto mine, wide with a terror that mirrored my own. "We have to contain this," he gasped, his breath rattling in his chest. "The Bureau can't let people see a real witch." Then, his eyes glazed over, his body went limp, and he slumped to the ground, losing consciousness. Gideon grabbed the agent's phone, his fingers fumbling with it. "No signal," he muttered, his voice grim. "But maybe we can find a vantage point to call for help." He handed me the rifle, his gaze frantic, searching. He started rifling through the pockets of the downed agents. One had a map, folded and worn, with cryptic markings scrawled around certain areas of the park. Another carried an official FBI badge, clipped to his belt. It read, "Special Agent Monroe." The same last name as mine, though obviously no relation. Something about that impossible coincidence sent a fresh, icy chill through me. Sarah, still shaky, hissed through clenched teeth, pulling me back from the horrifying scene. "We need to leave them, Alex. Now." Serafina, she could come back. Any moment. I hesitated, my gaze flickering between the fallen agents and Sarah's pale, drawn face. "We can't just leave them here to die." Gideon cursed under his breath, a low, frustrated sound. "Fine. We'll drag them to the shack. At least it'll be some shelter." And that's what we did. In a grueling, desperate effort that consumed the rest of the afternoon, we managed to haul the unconscious agents back to the dilapidated shack. They were alive, barely, their injuries sickeningly severe, as if they'd been slammed around, broken, by something far stronger, far more brutal than any human force. We patched them up as best we could, using the meager supplies we had left, propping them up against the dusty floor. One of them woke briefly, delirious, mumbling about containment and cover-ups, then drifted back into unconsciousness. Dusk settled, painting the forest in shades of deepening purple and shadow. And then, I heard it again, a distant chanting carried on the wind, weaving through the trees. "Serafina." My skin prickled with dread. Sarah seized up beside me, her body arching, her eyes rolling back in her head. A guttural sound, inhuman, animalistic, tore from her throat, a sound that curdled my blood, froze my veins. Gideon rushed to her side, pinning her arms, trying to restrain her thrashing limbs. Her strength was unnatural, terrifying, thrashing with a force that made him grunt with pain. "She's possessed," he said, his voice gritted, strained. "Serafina, she's trying to control her." I pressed a damp cloth to Sarah's burning forehead, tears blurring my vision, threatening to spill down my cheeks. "How do we stop it, Gideon? How?" He shook his head, his face grim, resolute. "But we have to sever Serafina's link to this land, Alex. That's the only way." We made a plan. Desperate, reckless. But it was all we had left. Gideon believed the anchor point, the source of Serafina's power, might be the old cabin itself. The place where her presence felt strongest, where the symbols were carved, where the nightmare had begun. According to his grandfather's notebook, if we destroyed it, burned it to the ground, dismantled its cursed symbols. It might break her hold. The problem was the cabin was half a day's trick away. And Seraphina's minions, her illusions, could be waiting for us at any turn. And Sarah was fading, slipping further and further away. We decided to leave her in the shack, barricaded as best we could, with the two unconscious agents. Gideon insisted, said she was too weak to travel, and might become dangerous if Seraphina fully took control. I reluctantly agreed, the decision tearing at my soul, leaving a raw, gaping wound in my chest. But we had no choice. "We'll do it fast," I told Sarah, taking her hand, her fingers cold, clammy. "Hold on, okay, just hold on." Her eyes were half-lidded, glazed with fever, her breathing shallow, ragged. She nodded weakly. Or so I thought. Then, Gideon and I set out, plunging back into the suffocating darkness of the forest. Guided by the weak beams of our headlamps, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate, flickering hope. The forest was a realm of shadows, every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, making me jump, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. We trudged in silence for hours, occasionally consulting the stars when the canopy thinned enough to offer a glimpse of the night sky. The deeper we went, the stronger that cloying, burnt herb smell became, permeating the air, clinging to our clothes, our skin. It felt like Seraphina was guiding us, luring us deeper into her web. But we pressed on. Finally, near dawn, exhausted, half delirious with fatigue and fear, we arrived back at the clearing. The clearing with the collapsed cabin. I half expected it to be gone. Vanished, changed, like the clearing with the stakes. But no, it stood there, stark and desolate in the pre-dawn gloom, just as we'd left it. Moldy beams, gaping windows, our ravaged campsite scattered around it like discarded toys. Tension coiled in my stomach, tight, agonizing. Gideon wasted no time. "Help me gather dry wood," he hissed, his voice urgent, strained, and kindling. "We're going to burn this place down." I nodded, numbly, mechanically. We worked rapidly, frantically, piling debris into the cabin, ripping planks from the rotting walls, anything that would burn. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the forest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of terror through me. I feared Seraphina would appear at any second, rising from the shadows. Or worse, that she'd already done something unspeakable to Sarah while we were gone. But I forced the thoughts away, burying them deep, focusing only on the task, the desperate, impossible task. When we had a decent heap of kindling piled in the center of the cabin's main room, Gideon pulled out a small, dented can of lighter fluid from his pack. He'd brought it for campfires, for s'mores and cheerful evenings around a crackling flame. How long ago, how impossibly distant, that felt now. He doused the dry wood, the sickly sweet smell of the fluid filling the air. I stood by the doorway, Gideon's rifle clutched in one hand, my headlamp beam cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating the interior of the cabin. Something inside caught my eye. A shape, scrolled crudely on the back wall, almost hidden in the shadows. The spiral with lines crossing through it. And beneath it, etched into the wood, the name. "Seraphina." My skin crawled. "Ready?" Gideon asked, his voice barely a whisper, his hands fumbling with a box of matches, his face pale, drawn, illuminated by the flickering headlamp. My breath hitched. Fear, cold and paralyzing, threatened to engulf me. But beneath it, a sliver of something else, resolve, desperation, hope. Maybe. Do it, I said, my voice hoarse, barely audible. He struck a match. The tiny flame flared to life in the darkness. He touched it to the soaked kindling. The fluid ignited with a whoosh, a sudden, violent eruption of fire. Flames licked up the dry wood. Hungrily, greedily. Sparks danced across the decrepit walls, catching, spreading. Thick, black smoke billowed outwards, choking the air, driving us back, stumbling outside. The cabin started to groan, a low, mournful sound, as the fire spread, consuming the ancient wood. Cracks spider-webbed across the weakened beams. And then, a shriek, a piercing, inhuman shriek that split the air, echoing off the trees, sending birds scattering from their roosts in panicked flight. My hair stood on end. Gideon and I whirled around, searching for the source, our eyes straining in the smoky, pre-dawn light. Nothing. Just the roaring flames, the crackling fire, the oppressive silence of the forest. Then, another shriek, closer this time, raw with rage and pain, and a dark figure materialized at the edge of the clearing, stepping out of the shadows into the flickering firelight. Seraphina. She lunged at Gideon with frightening speed, a blur of motion, her nails, sharpened to points, raking across his chest. He stumbled back with a cry of pain, clutching at his bleeding chest. I tried to raise the rifle, to aim, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold it steady. But before I could even get her in my sights, Seraphina turned, her head snapping towards me, her gaze locking onto mine. Her eyes, they burned with that sickly, malevolent green light, intensified by rage. You dare defy me? Her voice hissed, layered with that monstrous, echoing quality, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones, to shake the very ground beneath my feet. The next thing I knew, an invisible force slammed into me, a crushing, brutal impact that sent me flying backwards through the air. I slammed into a tree trunk, the rough bark digging into my back. The air knocked from my lungs, the rifle ripped from my grasp, skittering away into the undergrowth. My vision blurred, stars exploding behind my eyes. Seraphina advanced, her silhouette flickering against the roaring flames of the burning cabin, chanting again, those guttural, inhuman words reverberating in my skull, shaking me to my core. Gideon, bleeding from his chest, his face contorted in pain, tried to tackle her, to stop her. But she just flung him aside, like a rag doll. He crashed to the ground, landing heavily, motionless. The cabin roared, flames engulfing the roof now, consuming everything. I felt the heat on my face, even from across the clearing. And through the haze of pain and fear, I saw Seraphina turn back to me, her eyes burning, her hand raised, ready to unleash whatever dark power she held.